The harsh Montana sky stretched endlessly above Blackwood Ridge Ranch, a cloudless blue that promised no mercy from the relentless summer heat. The year was 1892, and in this unforgiving territory, a man's worth was measured by three things: the cattle that bore his brand, the land that carried his name, and the legacy he'd leave when the earth finally claimed him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jackson Blackwood had all three in abundance: 5,000 acres, 10,000 head of cattle, and a reputation that made men lower their voices when he entered a room. But what Jackson wanted most was something he couldn't brand or buy: water rights to Whispering Creek, the lifeblood that separated his prosperous ranch from the modest but strategically placed Pine Valley homestead. And the only thing standing between Jackson and complete control of the valley was a slip of a woman folks called the Winter Witch. But this story isn't about Jackson Blackwood. It's about his son, Thomas, and how one forced marriage revealed that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found in the land beneath our feet, but in the hearts we never planned to know. Thomas Blackwood stood on the wide porch of the main house, watching as summer dust devils danced across the sun-baked pasture. At 32, he'd spent his life being the dutiful son, the reliable heir, the man who followed orders without question. His shoulders carried the weight of expectations as naturally as his worn leather vest, and the lines around his eyes had deepened not from laughter, but from squinting into horizons that never seemed to change. The sound of his father's boots on the hardwood pulled him from his thoughts. Jackson Blackwood's presence filled a room like smoke, unavoidable, suffocating, impossible to ignore. "Thomas." His father's voice was gravel and whiskey. "In my office, now." Thomas followed, hat in hand, the way he'd been taught since childhood. Respect was currency in the Blackwood household, and Jackson demanded payment in full. The office was cool and dark, sheltered from the afternoon heat by thick log walls. Maps of the territory covered one wall, each parcel of Blackwood land marked in red ink that looked too much like blood for Thomas's comfort. Jackson didn't sit. He stood. Behind his massive oak desk, fingers drumming on a yellowed envelope. "Railroad's coming through," Jackson said without preamble. "Surveyors confirmed it yesterday. Line's gonna cut straight through Pine Valley." Thomas nodded. The railroad had been rumored for months, promising to transform Silver Creek from a dusty outpost to a proper town. "Good news for the territory. Good news for us," Jackson corrected, "if we control both sides of the creek. That Bennett land is sitting on what's going to be the most valuable property in 3 counties. Thomas tensed. The Bennett homestead had been a source of contention for as long as he could remember. Old Isaac Bennett had refused to sell to Jackson for decades, and when Isaac died last winter, his daughter Eleanor had continued the stubborn tradition. "Eleanor Bennett still won't sell?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. Jackson's laugh held no humor. "That dried-up spinster is as stubborn as her old man, but there's more than one way to claim land." He slid the envelope across. "The desk. Judge Parker owed me a favor. Marriage license is all drawn up, just needs signatures." Thomas stared at the envelope as though it might bite. "Marriage license? You're marrying Eleanor Bennett on Saturday." The words hung in the air like smoke from a shotgun blast. Thomas didn't move, didn't blink, just felt the world tilt beneath his boots. "You expect me to marry a woman I've barely spoken 10 words to?" The question came out calmer than he felt. Jackson's eyes narrowed. "I expect you to do what's needed. For this family, that land's the key to everything. Water rights, railroad money, expansion. She gets a name and security. We get the land. Simple business." "Marriage isn't business," Thomas said, surprising himself with the defiance in his voice. "Everything's business." Jackson leaned forward, palms flat on the desk. "You think your mother and I married for love? We married for land and cattle. And position. Love's a luxury, boy, one we can't afford when the stakes are this high. Thomas thought of Eleanor Bennett. He'd glimpsed her occasionally in town, always from a distance. A thin woman with her hair pulled back severe and tight, shapeless dresses the color of dust, eyes that never sought connection. Folks called her the winter witch behind her back, said she was odd, unfriendly, that she talked to plants more than people. Some whispered her herbal remedies had suspicious powers, though Dr. Parker himself was known to send patients her way. When his conventional treatments failed, "She's nearly 30, Jackson continued. No prospects, struggling to maintain that land on her own. She'll see the sense in it. And if she refuses..." Jackson's smile was cold. "She won't. Sheriff's been making noise about those back taxes her father supposedly didn't pay. Amazing how those problems might disappear with the right family connection." Disgust rose in Thomas's throat. "Blackmail. Strategy," Jackson corrected. "This territory wasn't built on niceties. It was built on men who knew what needed doing and did it." Thomas wanted to argue, to walk out, to ride until the Blackwood brand was just a memory on the horizon. But generations of duty weighed on him like iron shackles. "Have you even spoken to her about this?" he asked. "Sheriff Hayes is delivering the proposal now, as a courtesy." Jackson retrieved a cigar from his desk drawer, a signal that the discussion was over. Saturday at noon, Silver Creek Church. Thomas walked out, the unopened envelope heavy in his hand. The afternoon sun hit him like a physical blow as he stepped onto the porch. He didn't stop at the main house, just saddled his horse and rode toward the half-built cabin at the far edge of Blackwood property. The place he'd been working on in secret, board by board, nail by nail. A place that would have been his own. Someday, a dream now turning to dust. As he rode, he pictured Eleanor Bennett's face, or what little he knew of it. Plain, people said, unfriendly, cold as winter. The thought of binding himself to a stranger made his chest tight, but it wasn't just his own happiness at stake. What kind of marriage could be built on coercion and blackmail? What kind of life would that be for either of them? The cabin came into view, its unfinished walls a testament to hope interrupted. Thomas dismounted, tied his horse, and stood in what would have been the doorway, looking at the half-completed roof and the stack of lumber, waiting for a future that would never come. "Damn you, old man," he muttered to the empty space. 3 days until Saturday. 3 days until he'd marry a woman he didn't know, didn't love, had never even properly met. The thought should have filled him with dread, but as the sun began, its descent over Whispering Creek, another emotion crept in, curiosity. What kind of woman had held out against Jackson Blackwood all these years? What was she thinking right now as the sheriff delivered the terms of surrender disguised as a proposal? In the distance, a lone figure on horseback approached the Bennett property. Thomas recognized Sheriff Hayes's distinctive silhouette against the setting sun. The meeting that would change 2 lives forever was about to begin. Eleanor Ellie Bennett sat at her kitchen table, sorting through bundles of dried herbs with practiced hands. Yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for pain, echinacea for infection, each tied and labeled in her neat handwriting. The cabin was small but immaculate, every surface scrubbed clean, every item in its place. Order was her armor against a world that had never been particularly kind. The knock at the door came just as she finished tying off a bundle of chamomile. She wasn't expecting anyone. Few people ventured out to the Bennett homestead unless they were desperate for her remedies. And even then, most preferred to meet her in town, away from the isolation of Pine Valley and the whispers that followed. Her name. Sheriff Hayes stood on her porch, hat in hand, discomfort evident in the set of his shoulders. Behind him, the sun was setting over Whispering Creek, turning the water to liquid fire. "Miss Bennett," he nodded. "Might I have a word?" Eleanor stepped back, allowing him entry but not offering refreshment. Sheriff Hayes had been her father's friend once, before Jackson Blackwood's influence reached the sheriff's office. Now, his presence usually meant trouble. "What brings you all the way out here, Sheriff?" She remained standing, arms folded, across her chest. Hayes cleared his throat, eyes darting around the cabin as though searching for an escape. "I've come with a proposition from Jackson Blackwood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but her spine stiffened. "Mr. Blackwood knows my position on selling this land. It hasn't changed since my father's time." "It's not about selling," Hayes said, then hesitated. "It's about marriage." For the first time in years, Eleanor felt genuinely surprised. Marriage? To Thomas Blackwood, Jackson's son. Hayes rushed on, words tumbling over each other. "You'd keep your claim to the land technically. It would just become part of the Blackwood holdings through the marriage. You'd have security, protection, the Blackwood name." Eleanor's laugh was brief and brittle. And what would Thomas Blackwood get from this arrangement, besides a dried-up spinster and a few hundred acres of disputed land? Hayes had the decency to look uncomfortable. "This drought's hit everyone hard, Miss Bennett. Railroads coming through. This is a sensible solution for all parties." "All parties," Eleanor repeated. "And has Thomas Blackwood agreed to this sensible solution?" "He will," Hayes said, confidence returning to his voice. "It's his duty to the family." Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the land her father had loved, that she had fought to keep. The creek glittered in the distance, the water rights more valuable than gold in this parched season. "And if I refuse this generous offer?" Hayes shifted his weight. "There's the matter of those back taxes. County records show some. Discrepancies in your father's payments could be messy, could even result in the property being seized." "Taxes my father paid in full," Eleanor said, voice sharp as winter ice, "with receipts I still possess." "Records get lost," Hayes shrugged. "Courts favor those with means and influence." The threat hung in the air between them, naked and ugly. Eleanor turned back to the window, considering the land that was her heritage and her future. The railroad would bring opportunity, but it would also bring change she couldn't control alone. Jackson Blackwood would never stop coming for what he wanted. He'd find another way if this one failed. "Saturday," Hayes pressed, "noon at Silver Creek Church. It's a fair offer, Miss Bennett. Better than most women in your position could hope for." Eleanor remained silent until Hayes placed his hat back on his head, taking her lack of outright refusal as acceptance enough. "I'll let the Blackwoods know you'll be there," he said, moving toward the door. "Sheriff," Eleanor called as his hand reached for the knob, "tell Mr. Blackwood, both Mr. Blackwoods, that I have conditions of my own." Hayes paused. "Conditions? If I'm to consider this proposal, I want to meet Thomas Blackwood first. Alone. Tomorrow at sundown. Here." Hayes frowned. "That's not how—" "Those are my terms," Eleanor cut him off. "If he can't be bothered to look me in the eye before binding his life to mine, then we have nothing more to discuss." After the sheriff departed, Eleanor sat in the gathering darkness, her hands perfectly still in her lap. In the back room, tucked between the pages of her father's Bible, was a folded document she'd never shown anyone, a document that could change everything. But revealing it would require trust, and trust was a commodity as rare as rain in this drought-stricken territory. The next evening, Thomas Blackwood rode alone to the Bennett homestead, apprehension knotting his stomach. He'd argued with his father about this meeting. Jackson had seen no need for it, calling it a waste of time when the deal was all but done. But Thomas had insisted. If he was to marry this woman, he would at least look her in the eye first. try to understand what he was walking into. The Bennett cabin was smaller than he expected, but meticulously maintained. A large garden stretched behind it, bursting with plants both familiar and strange, thriving despite the drought that had withered crops throughout the territory. The contrast with the dry surrounding landscape was striking, almost unnatural. Before he could dismount, the door opened. Eleanor Bennett stepped onto the porch, her figure silhouetted against the warm light from inside. She wore a simple blue dress, her brown hair pulled back in her customary severe style, but loose tendrils framed a face that was neither as plain nor as cold as town gossip had led him to believe. "Mr. Blackwood," she acknowledged with a slight nod. Thomas removed his hat. "Miss Bennett, thank you for agreeing to see me." "I didn't agree to the arrangement," she corrected. "Only to this meeting." Thomas nodded, appreciating her directness. "That's fair." Eleanor gestured to 2 chairs on the porch. "Would you care to sit? I've made tea." The civilized gesture surprised him. He'd expected hostility, perhaps tears, not this composed woman, offering tea as though they were discussing a business partnership rather than a forced marriage. Once seated, an awkward silence settled between them. Eleanor poured tea into 2 cups, her movements precise and graceful. "I imagine you have questions," Thomas finally said. "Just one." Eleanor met his gaze directly. "Was this your idea or your father's?" The question was so unexpected in its bluntness that Thomas found himself answering honestly. "My father's. I knew nothing about it until yesterday." Eleanor nodded as though confirming something she already suspected. "And you agreed because?" "Because my father made it clear there was no choice," Thomas admitted, "for either of us." A flicker of something, appreciation for his honesty perhaps, crossed Eleanor's face. "At least we begin with truth, even if it's an unpleasant one." Thomas studied her as she sipped her tea. Her hands were slender but strong, bearing calluses that spoke of hard work. Her profile was delicate, proud, nothing like the shrewish spinster of town gossip. "People in town call you the Winter Witch," he said abruptly, immediately regretting the tactless observation. To his surprise, Eleanor smiled slightly. "People say a lot of things about what they don't understand. I grow herbs. I make remedies. Some work better than the doctors, which makes him uncomfortable. And the rumors about your unusual abilities?" Eleanor's eyebrow arched. "Are you asking if I can curse the cattle or summon storms, Mr. Blackwood? I assure you, if I could, your father's threats would hardly concern me." Despite everything, Thomas found himself smiling. "I suppose not." Eleanor set down her cup. "If we're to be married on Saturday, perhaps you should call me Eleanor. Or Ellie, as my father did." "Thomas," he offered in return. "Few call me Tom, except my mother when she was alive." A moment of understanding passed between them, 2 people who had lost, who carried the weight of absent parents and inherited responsibilities. "Why did you want to meet me?" Thomas asked. "It doesn't change what's happening." Eleanor rose and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the land bathed in the golden light of sunset. "I wanted to see what kind of man I'm being sold to. Whether you're your father's son in nature as well as name." The assessment stung, but Thomas couldn't deny its fairness. "And your verdict?" Eleanor turned, her expression unreadable. "I haven't decided, but I have a condition for this marriage." "I'm listening." "My land remains mine," she said firmly. "In writing, I'll be your wife in name, but Pine Valley stays under my control." Thomas frowned. "My father won't agree to that." "Then I won't agree to the marriage," Eleanor replied, calmly. "I can fight the tax claims. It will be messy and costly, but not impossible. You're asking me to defy my father." "I'm asking you to decide what kind of man you are," Eleanor corrected. "One who takes what isn't freely given, or one who respects the boundaries of others." The challenge hung between them, impossible and necessary all at once. Thomas stood, placing his hat back on his head. "I'll see you at the church on Saturday," he said, neither accepting nor rejecting her terms. Noon. Eleanor nodded once, her face composed. "If I'm there, you'll have your answer about my condition. If I'm not, you'll have it as well." As Thomas rode back toward Blackwood Ridge, the setting sun at his back, he found himself turning over the conversation in his mind. Eleanor Bennett was nothing like he expected. Not the bitter spinster, not the strange witch, but a woman of quiet strength and surprising complexity. For the first time since receiving his father's decree, Thomas felt something besides resignation. Curiosity, perhaps, or challenge. What would she reveal on their wedding night, he wondered. Not in the way men typically wondered about brides, but in the deeper sense. What truths, what secrets, what parts of herself did Eleanor Bennett keep hidden from a world that had already judged her without knowing her? Saturday dawned clear and merciless, the Montana sky a perfect blue that promised no relief from the heat. Silver Creek Church stood white and stark against the landscape, its modest steeple the tallest structure in town. By 11:30, a small crowd had gathered, not out of celebration, but curiosity. The union of Blackwood and Bennett was unexpected. News, fodder for speculation and whispered conversation. Thomas stood at the front of the church, uncomfortably aware of the eyes upon him. His father sat in the front pew, expression satisfied, a man watching his strategies unfold as planned. The minister fidgeted with his Bible, clearly as unsettled by the arrangement as everyone else. Noon approached, then passed. 5 minutes, 10. The whispers grew louder. Jackson Blackwood's face darkened with each passing minute. "Where is she, Eddie?" he hissed. Thomas didn't answer, a strange mixture of disappointment and relief warring in his chest. Had she refused after all? Chosen to fight rather than submit? The church door opened at 12:15, sending a shaft of blinding sunlight across the worn wooden floor. Eleanor Bennett stood framed in the doorway, alone. She wore a simple dress of deep green, her hair arranged more softly than Thomas had ever seen it, small white flowers woven through the brown waves. She carried no bouquet, wore no veil, but her head was high, her steps measured as she walked down the aisle. A murmur rippled through the assembled onlookers. "Eleanor Bennett. Clean up right nice," someone whispered. "Doesn't look half as witchy today," another replied. Thomas watched her approach, trying to read her expression. Had she accepted his unspoken promise to honor her condition? Or was this a different kind of defiance? She took her place beside him, her eyes meeting his briefly, steady, clear, revealing nothing. "Decided to join us after all, Miss Bennett," Jackson Blackwood remarked, voice carrying in the small church. Eleanor didn't look at him. "I had preparations to make, Mr. Blackwood, important documents to finalize." Thomas caught the emphasis on the word documents and understood. She had found a way to protect her land, with or without his help. The realization brought unexpected relief. The ceremony was brief, functional. The minister spoke of duties and responsibilities, but carefully avoided mentions of love or devotion. When it came time for the rings, Thomas realized he had none to offer. This detail in the rush of arrangement had been overlooked. Eleanor surprised him by producing a simple gold band from her pocket. "My mother's," she explained quietly, "for appearances." When the minister pronounced them man and wife, no kiss was exchanged. A handshake, formal and proper, sealed the transaction. As they turned to face the congregation, Thomas was struck by the strangeness of it all. He was now bound to this woman he barely knew, this woman who defied expectations at every turn. The celebration, such as it was, moved to the Silver Creek Hotel dining room. Jackson Blackwood held court, accepting congratulations as though the marriage had been a long-planned alliance rather than a hastily arranged acquisition. Eleanor stood apart from the crowd, accepting the cautious well-wishes of townsfolk who had always kept their distance, but were now uncertain how to treat the newest Blackwood bride. "Never thought I'd see the day," Martha Jenkins said, her voice carrying across the room. "The Winter Witch becoming a Blackwood. Suppose she'll move that strange garden of hers to the ridge now." "Martha," Thomas interrupted, suddenly appearing beside his new wife. "Wonderful to see you. Have you met my wife properly? Eleanor is quite knowledgeable about medicinal plants. Didn't your youngest have that terrible cough last winter? Perhaps she could recommend something." Martha stammered, caught between gossip and necessity. Well, yes, Emily did struggle terribly." "Elderberry syrup with a touch of thyme," Eleanor said calmly. "I'll bring some by next week." As Martha retreated, Thomas caught the flicker of surprise in Eleanor's eyes. At his intervention, "You didn't need to do that," she said quietly. "Perhaps not," he agreed, "but we're bound now, for better or worse. Might as well begin with civility." Eleanor studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly. "Thank you." As the afternoon wore on, Thomas found himself watching Eleanor navigate the room, reserved but dignified, answering questions politely but volunteering little. She was neither the cold witch of rumors nor the broken woman surrendering to coercion. She was herself. Authentic in a way few people in his experience had ever been. When evening fell, the inevitable moment arrived. They would be expected to return to Blackwood Ridge, to the small but private guest house Jackson had designated as their new home, until proper arrangements could be made. The ride was silent, the weight of what awaited them hanging heavy between them. The guest house was simple but comfortable. 2 rooms, a kitchen, a small sitting area. Someone had lit lamps and left a cold supper on the table. Eleanor moved through the space with careful steps, taking inventory of what would now be her home. "I'll take the sofa," Thomas said, breaking the silence. Eleanor turned, surprise evident in her expression. "You don't expect—" "This isn't that kind of marriage," Thomas said firmly. "Whatever my father's intentions, I won't—" He stopped, searching for words. "You didn't choose this. Neither did I. We can share a roof without sharing more unless we choose otherwise," Eleanor finished for him, a hint of relief in her voice. Thomas nodded. "Exactly." A moment of understanding passed between them, tension easing from the room. Eleanor moved to her bag and withdrew a sealed envelope. "There's something you should see," she said, extending it toward him. "Something I discovered among my father's papers after he died. I believe it's what your father has been after all these years." Thomas accepted the envelope, curious. Inside was an old map, yellowed with age, marked with notations in faded ink. "What am I looking at?" he asked. Eleanor stepped closer, her finger tracing a line along Whispering Creek. "My father was a surveyor before he settled here. He discovered something when mapping the valley. Look at the markings along this ridge." Thomas studied the map more carefully, understanding dawning. "Is this—" "Silver," Eleanor confirmed. "A vein running through the limestone on my property. Not just water rights, not just railroad access. A silver deposit potentially worth more than all the Blackwood cattle combined." Thomas stared at the map, then at Eleanor, pieces falling into place. "This is why you insisted your land remain yours." Eleanor's expression was calm, but determined. "I didn't know if I could trust you. I still don't. But I wanted you to know what you're part of, what your father is really after." "Does he know about this?" "He suspects," Eleanor said. "My father hinted at it once when refusing to sell." "A mistake. He never showed the map to anyone, kept it hidden. I only found it after his death." Thomas set the map on the table, mind racing. This changed everything: the power dynamics, the stakes, the future they faced together. "Why show me this now?" he asked. "I could take this straight to my father." "You could," Eleanor acknowledged, "and that would tell me everything I need to know about what kind of man I've married." The challenge in her eyes was unmistakable. A test. A chance to prove himself different from his father, to make a choice based on something more than duty and obligation. "What do you want to do with this information?" Thomas asked carefully. Eleanor took a deep breath. "I want to develop the mine properly, safely, with fair wages and decent conditions for workers. Not the way your father would do it, extracting every ounce as quickly and cheaply as possible, regardless of cost to the land or the men. That would take capital, expertise." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "I have knowledge, but not means. You have connections, but needed knowledge of the deposit." She met his gaze directly. "Perhaps this marriage could be a partnership after all, a true one based on mutual benefit rather than coercion." Thomas looked at the woman before him, intelligent, principled, offering not surrender, but collaboration. Nothing like the cold spinster of town gossip. Nothing like the simple acquisition his father had anticipated. "A partnership," he repeated, testing the word, finding he liked the sound of it. He extended his hand. "I believe I could agree to those terms, Mrs. Blackwood." Eleanor took his hand, her grip firm. "Eleanor," she corrected, "or Ellie, if we're to be partners." Their hands remained joined a moment longer than necessary, something new and unexpected passing between them. Respect, possibility, perhaps even the first fragile seed of trust. That night, Thomas kept his word and slept on the sofa. But as moonlight filtered through the windows, casting silver patterns across the floor of their small home, both lay awake, contemplating the revelation of the evening. Not just the silver beneath the ground, but the discovery that in their forced union they might have found something rare and valuable, an ally where each had expected only an adversary. And in the quiet darkness, a different kind of richness began to take root, one not measured in acres or mineral deposits, but in the slow, cautious growth of understanding between two people who had expected the worst and found, instead, the possibility of something better. Morning came with golden fingers of light stretching across the floorboards of the guest house. Thomas awoke with a stiff neck from the narrow sofa, momentarily disoriented before remembering he was a married man now. The events of the previous day rushed back. The wedding, the celebration that wasn't really a celebration, and most significantly, the map Eleanor had shown him. He sat up, rubbing his neck, and glanced toward the bedroom door. It remained closed. In the small kitchen area, he quietly stoked the stove and put coffee on to boil, grateful for the familiar ritual in this unfamiliar situation. The bedroom door opened as the coffee began to percolate. Eleanor emerged, already dressed in a simple blue work dress, her hair neatly braided but without the severe style she typically wore in town. The softness of it framed her face differently, highlighting cheekbones and eyes that Thomas hadn't properly noticed before. "Good morning," he offered, uncertain of the proper protocol between them. "Morning," she replied, her voice carrying the slightest rasp of sleep. "You made coffee." "Least I could do after taking the more comfortable sleeping arrangement," he said with an attempt at lightness. A hint of a smile touched her lips. "The sofa doesn't look particularly comfortable. I've slept in worse places." Thomas poured 2 cups of coffee, offering one to Eleanor. "We should discuss what happens next." Eleanor accepted the cup, her fingers brushing his momentarily. "I imagine your father will be expecting a report on his newest acquisition." The bitterness in her tone was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas couldn't blame her. "He'll likely ride Over later today, Thomas confirmed, leaning against the counter, eager to establish the new arrangements. "And what will you tell him?" Eleanor asked, studying him over the rim of her cup. "About the map? About our agreement?" Thomas considered the question carefully. The map, with its promise of silver wealth, still lay on the table where they'd left it the night before, the potential future it represented hanging between them. "Nothing," he decided. "Not yet. My father is a man who takes what he wants. If he knew about the silver deposit, he'd find a way to claim it regardless of our agreement." Eleanor's posture relaxed slightly, though her eyes remained watchful. "So we maintain the pretense. The dutiful son and his plain, spinster wife resigned to their arrangement." "For now," Thomas agreed, "until we can make proper plans for the mine. My father may control this territory, but he doesn't control everything. There are investors in Helena who might back a mining operation without his involvement. If they would trust a woman and her supposedly henpecked husband," Eleanor noted wryly. Thomas found himself smiling despite the circumstances. "They'll trust the silver, and whatever they might think of either of us, appearances can be useful." He paused, a thought occurring to him. "We should move your things from Pine Valley. Make the arrangement appear permanent and complete." Eleanor tensed. "My garden can be relocated," Thomas finished. "At least the plants that will survive transplantation. I can help." Surprise flickered across Eleanor's face. "You know something about plants. Perhaps neither of us is quite what people think." By mid-afternoon, the wagon was loaded with everything Eleanor deemed essential. She stood in the doorway of the cabin, taking a final look at the home she'd shared with her father. "We'll come back," Thomas said, understanding her hesitation. "This is still your land." Eleanor nodded, her expression composed. "Yes, but it feels like an ending nonetheless." They were preparing to depart when the sound of approaching riders made them both tense. 3 men on horseback appeared on the ridge. Jackson Blackwood, flanked by 2 ranch hands. "Damn," Thomas muttered. "I'd hoped to be back before he came looking." Eleanor's face hardened into the mask she wore in town, remote, composed, revealing nothing. Thomas realized with sudden clarity that it was a protective measure, a shield against judgment and expectation. Jackson Blackwood surveyed the loaded wagon with narrowed eyes as he dismounted. "Thought I might find you here. Didn't expect a moving operation quite so soon." "Mrs. Blackwood wished to collect her belongings," Thomas replied, deliberately formal. "I'm helping my wife settle into her new home." Jackson's gaze flicked to Eleanor, assessing her with the same calculating look he gave to cattle at auction. "Mrs. Blackwood," he acknowledged with a nod that stopped short of respectful. "I trust you're finding the accommodations at Blackwood Ridge satisfactory." "They're adequate," Eleanor replied coolly. Jackson's mouth tightened at her lack of gratitude. "I see you're bringing your herbs." He gestured at the carefully packed plants. "I'm not sure we need witch remedies at Blackwood Ridge. Dr. Parker serves our medical needs quite well." Thomas stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Eleanor and his father. Eleanor's knowledge of medicinal plants is an asset. Several neighboring ranches rely on her remedies. Jackson raised an eyebrow at his son's defense. "Is that so? Well, I suppose every bride brings something to the marriage, even if it's just weeds and superstition." Thomas felt rather than saw Eleanor stiffen beside him. "We should be going," he said firmly. "It'll be dark soon." "One moment," Jackson said, his attention shifting to the cabin. "Now that this property is effectively Blackwood land, I want to survey it properly. See about diverting more of the creek water to our south pastures." "The property remains in Eleanor's name," Thomas corrected, tension building in his chest. "As agreed." Jackson waved a dismissive hand. "A legal technicality. You're married now. What's hers is yours. What's yours is the family's." He moved toward the cabin door. I'll just have a quick look inside." "No!" Eleanor's voice cut through the air, sharp as a whip crack. "You won't." Jackson turned slowly, unaccustomed to being denied. "Excuse me?" "This is still my property," Eleanor said, each word precise and clear. "Our marriage doesn't change that. You weren't invited inside." The two ranch hands exchanged uncomfortable glances. Jackson's face darkened like a thunderhead. "Perhaps you misunderstand your position, Mrs. Blackwood. Your debt problems are resolved," Thomas interrupted, stepping fully to Eleanor's side now. "The marriage satisfies any claims against the property, but the deed remains in Eleanor's name. That was our agreement." Father and son stared at each other, the air between them charged with an unfamiliar tension. Thomas had never openly defied his father before, and the sensation was both terrifying and strangely liberating. "An agreement?" Jackson repeated dangerously. "I don't recall being consulted about any agreement." "It was between me and my wife," Thomas replied steadily. Jackson studied his son, seeming to truly see him for the first time in years. Whatever he found in Thomas's expression made him recalculate his approach. "Very well," he said with forced lightness. "Family squabbles over property are hardly appropriate in front of the men. We'll discuss this further at home." He mounted his horse with fluid grace despite his age. "I expect you both for dinner tomorrow night. The new Mrs. Blackwood should meet the rest of the family properly." Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Jackson wheeled his horse around, gesturing for the ranch hands to follow, but paused to look back at Eleanor. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Blackwood. I hope you'll find it educational." The threat beneath the pleasantry was unmistakable. Eleanor merely inclined her head, her expression revealing nothing. Only when the riders had disappeared over the ridge did she release a shaky breath. "He suspects something," she said quietly. "He always suspects something," Thomas replied, helping her onto the wagon seat. "It's how he's survived so long, but he doesn't know about the silver, not for certain." Eleanor gathered the reins, her knuckles white. "He won't stop pushing." "No," Thomas agreed, mounting his horse alongside the wagon. "He won't." They traveled back to Blackwood Ridge in thoughtful silence, each contemplating the confrontation and its implications. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail, the landscape beautiful despite the tension that had marked the day. As they approached the ranch, Eleanor spoke. "We'll need to be careful at dinner tomorrow." "Yes," Thomas agreed. "My father will be watching us closely, examining our arrangement." Eleanor glanced at him. "Do you think he expects a real marriage?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with unspoken implications. Thomas considered his answer carefully. "He expects whatever serves his purposes," he finally replied. "A united front might be to our advantage." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I can play the dutiful daughter-in-law if needed." "And I the satisfied husband," Thomas added, "though it might surprise everyone who knows me." A hint of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Are you not known for satisfaction, Thomas Blackwood?" The unexpected touch of humor caught him off guard. "I'm known for duty. Satisfaction has rarely entered the equation." They reached the guest house as evening approached, the western sky painted in spectacular oranges and purples. Thomas helped Eleanor unload the wagon, careful with the precious plants and books that represented her life's knowledge and connection to her father. "We can set up a small garden plot behind the house," he suggested. "It gets good morning sun." Eleanor surveyed the space with a critical eye. It could work. The soil needs improvement, but some of the hardier plants will manage. They worked together until darkness fell, arranging her possessions within the small house until it began to reflect both of their presences. Her books alongside his few personal items, her herbs hanging to dry from the kitchen rafters, his saddle and gear neatly placed by the door. As they finished a simple supper, Eleanor broke the comfortable silence. "I should prepare for tomorrow night. I haven't many dresses suitable for dinner at the main house." Thomas considered this. "There's a trunk of my mother's things in the storage room. She was about your height. Perhaps something there might serve, if you don't mind." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "That's kind of you to offer." Thomas retrieved the trunk, dust coating its surface from years of disuse. He set it before her almost reverently. "I haven't opened this since she died, 5 years now." Eleanor's expression softened. "You don't have to." "No, it's all right," Thomas said. She would have liked knowing her things were useful again. She was practical that way. Eleanor opened the trunk carefully. Inside lay neatly folded dresses, shawls, and accessories, all of good quality but not ostentatious, reflecting a woman of taste rather than wealth. "Your mother had lovely things," Eleanor observed, gently touching a deep blue dress with subtle embroidery at the collar. "She came from back east," Thomas explained. "Philadelphia. She brought refinement with her, though my father sometimes saw it as weakness." "Was she happy here?" Eleanor asked, her question gentle but direct. Thomas considered this. "Content, perhaps, resigned to her choice. She made the best of it." He paused, memories surfacing. "She kept her garden, read her books, taught me about things my father thought unimportant: poetry, stars, plants, small beauties." Eleanor looked up at him, really looked, as though seeing something new. "She taught you well, then?" Thomas felt strangely exposed under her gaze. "Try the blue dress," he suggested, changing the subject. "It would suit you." Eleanor held it up, assessing. "Thank you, I'll take good care of it." "It's yours now," Thomas said simply. "Whatever you wish to use." Later, after Eleanor had retired to the bedroom and Thomas had settled on the sofa, with an extra blanket, he found himself staring at the ceiling, turning the day's events over in his mind. He had stood up to his father, not dramatically, not definitively, but he had drawn a line nonetheless, and it had been for Eleanor, a woman he barely knew but was beginning to respect. What was happening between them wasn't romance. It was too new, too fragile, too complicated for that. But it was something. Partnership, perhaps. The beginning of trust. And in the world Thomas had grown up in, where power was currency and vulnerability was weakness, trust might be the most radical thing of all. Morning arrived with the sound of activity outside the guest house. Thomas woke to find Eleanor already dressed and peering out the window with concern. "What is it?" he asked, reaching for his shirt. "Ranch hands," she replied, setting up fence posts at the edge of the property. Thomas joined her at the window. Sure enough, 3 Blackwood hands were measuring and digging post holes along the small yard behind the guest house. "Stay here," he said, pulling on his boots and heading outside. The men looked up as Thomas approached, nodding respectfully. "Morning, Mr. Blackwood," the oldest of them greeted. "Morning, Pete. What's going on here?" Pete gestured at the partially installed posts. "Boss's orders. Said to fence in this section to keep the ladies' plants from spreading where they shouldn't. Called it a containment measure." Thomas clenched his jaw, understanding his father's message perfectly. The fence wasn't to protect Eleanor's garden. It was to define her limits, to physically mark her restricted territory within Blackwood land. "Pack it up," Thomas said quietly. Pete blinked. "Sir?" "I said pack it up. My wife's garden doesn't need fencing." The men exchanged uneasy glances. "But your father—" "I'll handle my father," Thomas cut in. "This is my home now, and I'll decide what's needed here." After a moment of hesitation, the men began gathering their tools. Thomas returned to the house, where Eleanor stood in the doorway, her expression a mixture of surprise and something like admiration. "That wasn't necessary," she said quietly. "Yes, it was," Thomas replied. "My father is testing boundaries." seeing how far he can push before we resist. Eleanor studied him. And now? Now we prepare for dinner, Thomas said grimly, because that was just the opening move. Throughout the day, they worked side by side establishing Eleanor's garden in its new location. Thomas found himself impressed by her knowledge, not just of medicinal properties, but of soil requirements, growth patterns, and cultivation techniques. This was no hobby. It was expertise born of years of careful study and practice. "How did you learn all this?" he asked, as they planted the last of the transplanted herbs. Eleanor sat back on her heels, brushing soil from her hands. "My father taught me some. The rest came from books, trial and error, and listening to the old women who still remembered the traditional ways." She glanced at him. "People will share knowledge if you approach them with respect rather than suspicion. Even with the daughter of Isaac Bennett? I thought your father kept to himself." A shadow crossed Eleanor's face. "That came later, after the disputes with your father began. Before that, we were just another family trying to build something." She paused, looking out across the vast Blackwood property. "It's strange to be here now, on the land my father considered enemy territory. Is that how you see it?" Thomas asked. "Enemy territory?" Eleanor considered this. "I see land that could be nurturing or destructive depending on how it's tended. Just like people." She met his gaze directly. "Your father sees resources to be exploited. What do you see, Thomas Blackwood?" The question lingered between them, profound in its simplicity. What did he see when he looked at the land that had been his birthright? Property, legacy, responsibility. "Possibility," he finally answered. "For better or worse." Eleanor nodded, seeming to accept this. They finished the planting in companionable silence, and as afternoon faded toward evening, they each prepared for the dinner that would be their first real test as a united front. Thomas bathed and dressed with unusual care, aware that appearances would matter tonight. When he emerged from the washroom, he found Eleanor standing in the middle of the small sitting area, wearing his mother's blue dress. The transformation was subtle but significant. The color brought out the warmth in her eyes. The cut of the dress emphasized a grace that her usual practical clothing concealed. Her hair was arranged simply but elegantly, with soft waves framing her face. Thomas found himself momentarily speechless. "Will this do?" Eleanor asked, misinterpreting his silence as disapproval. "You look—" Thomas searched for the right word. Beautiful seemed too intimate, too personal for what lay between them. "Perfect," he finally said. "Exactly right." A faint blush colored Eleanor's cheeks. "I haven't dressed like this in years, not since before my father fell ill." "It suits you," Thomas said simply. He offered his arm as they left the guest house, a gesture both practical and symbolic. They would present themselves as a united couple, whatever the reality of their arrangement might be. The main house of Blackwood Ridge stood imposing against the twilight sky. 2 stories of solid timber and stone, built to announce permanence and power. Unlike the simple practicality of the Bennett homestead, everything about the Blackwood house was designed to impress and intimidate. Eleanor's steps slowed as they approached. "It's larger than I expected." "My father believes in making statements," Thomas replied, "most of them unnecessary." This drew a small smile from Eleanor, easing some of the tension in her posture. Thomas found himself unexpectedly determined to protect her this evening, to shield her from his father's inevitable attempts to establish dominance. The housekeeper, Mrs. Collins, greeted them at the door with professional courtesy, though her gaze lingered curiously on Eleanor. "Mr. Blackwood is waiting in the dining room," she informed them, taking their coats. Thomas led Eleanor through the house, aware of her taking in the details. The expensive furnishings, the hunting trophies, the large landscape paintings that depicted Blackwood land in every season. It was a monument to his father's success, designed to remind visitors of their place in the hierarchy. Jackson Blackwood stood as they entered the dining room, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Ah, the newlyweds, right on time. His gaze assessed Eleanor critically, lingering on the blue dress. "I see you've found something suitable to wear, Mrs. Blackwood." "Thomas kindly offered his mother's things," Eleanor replied evenly. Something flickered in Jackson's expression. Surprise, perhaps irritation. "Is that so? How thoughtful." Thomas guided Eleanor to her seat, deliberately taking the chair beside her rather than at the foot of the table where he usually sat. The small rebellion wasn't lost on his father, whose mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Collins served the first course, a soup rich with vegetables and herbs. Eleanor waited until Jackson began eating before lifting her own spoon, her movements precise and proper. "I hope you're settling in well," Jackson said, his tone conversational, but his eyes watchful. "It must be quite an adjustment from your modest circumstances." "Every change requires adaptation," Eleanor replied smoothly. "But Thomas has been most accommodating." Jackson's eyebrow lifted at this. "Has he? My son has always been dutiful, though perhaps not known for his accommodating nature." "Perhaps you don't know him as well as you think," Eleanor suggested, her voice mild but the challenge unmistakable. A tense silence fell. Thomas found himself torn between admiration for Eleanor's composure and concern about his father's reaction. Jackson Blackwood was not a man accustomed to being challenged, especially not by women. After a calculated pause, Jackson changed tactics. "I understand you have some skill with herbs and remedies, Mrs. Blackwood. A hobby of sorts?" "A practice," Eleanor corrected. "One that served the community for years." "Indeed. Though Dr. Parker mentions that some of your treatments aren't based in modern medical science." Eleanor set down her spoon. "Dr. Parker consults me when his modern medical science fails to produce results, as do many in Silver Creek." Jackson smiled thinly. "How fortunate for them, though as a Blackwood now, you'll hardly need to continue peddling folk remedies. We have a certain position to maintain." Thomas felt his patience fraying. "Eleanor's knowledge is valuable, Father. Her work helps people." "Her work?" Jackson repeated, emphasizing the word. "Is that what we're calling it? Not witchcraft? Not superstition?" Eleanor didn't flinch. "Call it what you will, Mr. Blackwood. Results speak for themselves." "What I call it," Jackson replied, voice hardening, "is inappropriate for a Blackwood wife." "Enough." Thomas set down his napkin firmly. "Eleanor will continue her work with my full support. The matter isn't open for discussion." Father and son locked eyes across the table, the challenge explicit now. Jackson recovered first, his expression smoothing into something more diplomatic. "I see marriage has already changed you, son. Developing opinions, independent of family interests. How progressive of you." The rest of the meal continued in this vein, Jackson probing for weaknesses, Eleanor responding with quiet dignity, Thomas increasingly protective of his new wife. By the time dessert was served, the air was thick with unspoken tension. "I've been thinking," Jackson announced as coffee was poured, "about the Bennett property. Now that it's effectively part of Blackwood Holdings, we should discuss its best use. I'm considering diverting the creek to irrigate our south pastures." Eleanor's hand tightened around her coffee cup. "The creek sustains wildlife and plants that would die if diverted." "Progress requires sacrifice," Jackson dismissed. "One cannot be sentimental about these matters." "It's not sentiment," Eleanor countered. "It's practical ecology. Divert the creek and you'll change the entire valley's balance. The consequences could harm even your own grazing lands." Jackson's expression hardened. "I've managed this land for 40 years, Mrs. Blackwood. I hardly need lectures on ecology from a what, father?" Thomas interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. A tense silence fell. Jackson surveyed them both, seeming to reassess the situation. "From someone new to ranching," he finished smoothly. "No offense intended, of course." "Of course," Eleanor replied, her tone making it clear she understood the intended slight perfectly. As the evening drew to a close, Jackson walked them to the door, his manner once again cordial, as though the tensions of dinner had never occurred. "I expect you both at the Founders' Day celebration next week," he said. "The Blackwoods always make a proper showing. It will be your first public appearance as a married couple." "We'll be there," Thomas assured him, eager to end the evening. Jackson clasped his son's shoulder, his grip firm. "Eleanor," he acknowledged with a nod, deliberately using her first name now, an implied intimacy that hadn't been earned. "Welcome to the family. I'm sure we'll all adjust, eventually." As they walked back to the guest house under a star-filled sky, Eleanor released a long breath. "Your father is formidable." "He's a bully," Thomas replied bluntly. "Always has been. He's used to getting his way. Yet you stood up to him for me." Thomas glanced at her, struck by the starlight on her face, the blue dress moving gently in the evening breeze. "Not just for you, for myself as well, perhaps for the first time." They reached the guest house in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Inside, Thomas lit the lamps while Eleanor unpinned her hair, the gesture oddly intimate in the small shared space. "You should take the bed tonight," she said suddenly. "The sofa is too short for you." "I'm fine," Thomas assured her. "Don't be stubborn," Eleanor countered. "We can alternate. It's the practical solution." Thomas found himself smiling at her pragmatism. "Is there a practical solution for everything, Eleanor Bennett Blackwood?" "Not everything," she admitted, a hint of vulnerability crossing her face, "but enough to get by." In that moment, looking at this woman who faced his father's intimidation with quiet dignity, who approached their forced marriage with practicality rather than self-pity, Thomas felt something shift inside him, a recognition, perhaps, of a kindred spirit beneath their obvious differences. "We did well tonight," he said softly. "We did," Eleanor agreed. "Though this is just the beginning. Your father won't give up easily." "No," Thomas acknowledged. "He won't. But neither will we." The "we" hung in the air between them, significant in its casualness. Somehow, in the span of just 2 days, they had become a unit, allies against a common adversary. Not quite friends, certainly not lovers, but something undefined and potentially powerful. Eleanor moved toward the bedroom, pausing at the door. "Good night, Thomas Blackwood." "Good night, Eleanor," he replied, watching as she disappeared behind the door. Alone in the small sitting room, Thomas contemplated the strange turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he had been a man resigned to his father's control, living half a life of duty without purpose. Now he was married to a woman rumored to be a witch, keeper of a silver secret that could change everything. And for the first time in years, he felt awake, alive. Whatever came next, his father's machinations, the challenges of their unusual marriage, the complications of the silver deposit, Thomas knew with sudden certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. And strangely, unexpectedly, he was glad of it. The week following the tense dinner at the main house settled into an unexpected rhythm. Each morning, Thomas would rise early to tend to ranch business, leaving Eleanor to establish her garden and organize her collection of medicines and herbs. Each evening, they would share a simple meal, their conversation growing less stilted, more natural with each passing day. They had developed an unspoken routine, Thomas taking the bed one night, Eleanor the next, neither commenting on the arrangement beyond practical considerations. It wasn't a conventional marriage by any measure, but there was a growing comfort, in their companionship that surprised them both. The Founders' Day celebration loomed ahead, their first true public appearance as husband and wife. Eleanor spent hours carefully altering one of Catherine Blackwood's dresses to fit her properly, while Thomas found himself unusually concerned with how they would be received by the townsfolk of Silver Creek. "Do you think they'll expect us to act affectionate?" Eleanor asked 3 days before the event, looking up from her sewing. Thomas paused from cleaning his boots by the hearth. "Probably. People love gossip, especially about arranged marriages." "I'm not good at pretending," Eleanor admitted. "At the Bennett place, I never had to." Thomas studied her, the faint furrow between her brows, the precise movements of her fingers with the needle. "We don't have to pretend, just be comfortable with each other, like we are now." Eleanor met his gaze, a question in her eyes. "Are we comfortable? I wasn't sure." The honesty of the question caught Thomas off guard. Were they comfortable? The initial awkwardness had faded, replaced by something he couldn't quite name. Not intimacy exactly, but a growing awareness of each other, an ease that hadn't existed before. "I am," he said simply. "More than I expected to be." A small smile touched Eleanor's lips. "As am I." The moment hung between them, quiet and significant, before Eleanor returned to her sewing and Thomas to his boots. Neither felt the need to elaborate further, but something had shifted, acknowledged, if not defined. The morning of Founders' Day dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for the celebration that marked Silver Creek's establishment 30 years earlier. The town would be festooned with bunting and banners, the street lined with stalls selling food, crafts, and trinkets. There would be music, dancing, competitions, a rare day of leisure in a territory where hard work was the common currency. Eleanor emerged from the bedroom wearing Catherine Blackwood's best dress, now expertly altered to fit her slender frame. The deep burgundy color brought warmth to her complexion, the style more flattering than the shapeless garments she'd worn before. Her hair was arranged in soft waves rather than the severe bun she typically favored, with small pearl combs that Thomas recognized as his mother's. "Will this do?" she asked, smoothing the skirt nervously. Thomas found himself momentarily at a loss for words. The transformation wasn't dramatic. Eleanor hadn't suddenly become a different woman, but she had allowed a part of herself to emerge that had long been hidden beneath practical clothes and protective reserve. "More than do," he finally managed. "You look beautiful." A faint blush colored Eleanor's cheeks at the unexpected compliment. "Thank you. I wasn't sure about the color." "It suits you," Thomas assured her, offering his arm. "Shall we face the music?" Eleanor placed her hand on his arm, the gesture still new but becoming familiar. "Lead the way, Mr. Blackwood." They rode into town together, Thomas on horseback and Eleanor in the small buggy they'd begun using for trips to Silver Creek. The main street was already crowded with families from surrounding homesteads and ranches, everyone in their Sunday best despite the dust that inevitably coated everything in the territory. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Conversations paused, heads turned, whispers followed in their wake. The unexpected marriage of Thomas Blackwood to the Winter Witch was still fresh gossip, made more intriguing by their appearance as a seemingly compatible couple. "Everyone's staring," Eleanor murmured as Thomas helped her down from the buggy. "Let them," he replied quietly. "We have nothing to be ashamed of." He kept her hand in his a moment longer than necessary, a small gesture of solidarity that wasn't lost on the watching townsfolk. Eleanor squeezed his fingers briefly before releasing them, her own silent acknowledgement of their alliance. They made their way through the crowded street, stopping occasionally to exchange greetings with neighbors and acquaintances. Thomas noticed a subtle change in how people approached Eleanor. The wariness remained, but it was tempered now by curiosity and a reluctant respect for her new status as a Blackwood wife. "Thomas! Eleanor!" Sheriff Hayes hailed them from outside the makeshift refreshment tent. "Fine day for the celebration." Thomas nodded politely, aware that Hayes had been the messenger for his father's marriage scheme. "Sheriff." "Mrs. Blackwood," Hayes acknowledged, his eyes lingering on Eleanor's transformed appearance. "You're looking well. Marriage seems to agree with you." Eleanor's smile was polite but reserved. "Thank you, Sheriff. Though I find my health has more to do with purpose than marital status." Hayes cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Yes, well, Jackson mentioned you'll be attending the town meeting next week about the railroad route." "We plan to," Thomas confirmed, noting the use of "we" without conscious thought. "Eleanor's knowledge of the valley will be valuable to the discussion." Hayes blinked in surprise. "I see. Well, that's progressive of you." "Practical," Thomas corrected. "My wife has insights worth hearing." The emphasis on "wife" was deliberate, a public claim of alliance that made Hayes shift uncomfortably. The sheriff excused himself shortly after, clearly unsettled by the united front the Blackwoods presented. As they continued through the celebration, Thomas found himself increasingly aware of Eleanor beside him. Her composure in the face of curious stares, her quiet dignity when introduced to people who had previously avoided her, the occasional brush of her hand against his when the crowd pressed close. "Thomas!" His father's voice cut through the ambient noise of the celebration. Jackson Blackwood stood near the judge's table for the shooting competition, surveying his son and daughter-in-law with calculating eyes. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd attend after all." "Wouldn't miss it," Thomas replied evenly. Jackson's gaze lingered on Eleanor, taking in the burgundy dress, the pearl combs, the subtle transformation. Mrs. Blackwood, quite the change from the woman who sells herbs. Behind the mercantile, Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Circumstances change, Mr. Blackwood. People adapt." "Indeed they do," Jackson agreed with a thin smile, "though some adaptations are more convincing than others." Thomas felt tension building in his shoulders. "Is there something you wanted, Father?" "Just ensuring the family makes a proper showing," Jackson replied smoothly. "The shooting competition begins in 10 minutes. You're defending your title, I assume." The annual shooting contest had been a point of pride for Thomas in previous years. His steady hand and keen eye-making, him the consistent champion. This year, he'd given it little thought. "I hadn't planned to compete," he began, but Eleanor interrupted. "Of course he'll compete," she said with quiet confidence. "My husband is the best shot in the territory." Both Blackwood men turned to her in surprise. Eleanor met Thomas's questioning look with a subtle nod, a silent communication that startled him with its ease. "Apparently I'm competing," Thomas said, finding himself oddly pleased by Eleanor's confidence. Jackson's eyes narrowed at the wordless exchange between them. Excellent. The Blackwood reputation must be maintained. As Jackson moved away to speak with the competition organizers, Thomas turned to Eleanor. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she replied simply. "But your father was testing us again, seeing if he could drive a wedge." Thomas studied her face, impressed by her perception. "And you countered by showing unity." A faint smile touched Eleanor's lips. "I'm learning to play the game, Mr. Blackwood." "You play it well, Mrs. Blackwood," he returned, offering his arm once more. The shooting competition drew a sizable crowd, with competitors ranging from seasoned ranchers to young men eager to prove themselves. Thomas took his place in line, oddly conscious of Eleanor watching from the sidelines, her burgundy dress making her easy to spot among the spectators. The targets were set at increasing distances, eliminating shooters in each round until only the most skilled remained. Thomas moved through the competition with practiced ease, his focus narrowing to the sights of his rifle and the distant targets. When the final round came down to him and a rancher from the North Valley, he found his eyes briefly seeking Eleanor in the crowd. She stood at the edge of the gathering, her expression attentive, confident. When their eyes met, she gave him a small nod, not of encouragement, but of certainty. Of course he would win. It wasn't even a question. The unexpected faith steadied his already precise aim. His final shot split the center of the target cleanly, securing his victory by a clear margin. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, unsurprised by the outcome, but appreciative of the display of skill nonetheless. As Thomas accepted congratulations and the small silver cup that served as the prize, he caught sight of Eleanor speaking with Dr. Parker at the edge of the crowd. The doctor's expression was serious, his manner urgent. Eleanor nodded, her own face growing concerned. Thomas made his way toward them, excusing himself from well-wishers. "Is everything all right?" Dr. Parker turned, clearly relieved to see him. "Thomas, good. There's been an accident at the Miller farm. John Miller's boy fell from the hayloft, broken leg, possible internal injuries. I'm heading there now, but—" "You need Eleanor's remedies," Thomas finished, understanding immediately. Parker nodded, the admission clearly difficult for his professional pride. "Her pain tincture works faster than anything in my bag. And the infection salve—" "I have both at the house," Eleanor said decisively. "We'll fetch them immediately." "I'll ready the buggy," Thomas offered, already moving toward where they'd left their transportation. Dr. Parker looked between them, surprised by their immediate coordination. "Thank you both. I'll head to the Millers directly. Every minute counts." As they hurried back to Blackwood Ridge, Thomas noticed Eleanor's focused expression, all trace of the cautious socialite replaced by a woman with purpose and expertise. "How bad do you think it is?" he asked as they drove. "Bad enough if Parker is willing to ask for my help openly," Eleanor replied grimly. "He usually sends his nurse in secret." When they reached the guest house, Eleanor moved with practiced efficiency, gathering bottles and jars from her organized shelves. Thomas watched, impressed by her swift, certain movements. "The boy may need stitches," she muttered, adding a small leather case to her bag, "and something for shock." "You've done this before," Thomas observed. Eleanor glanced up briefly. "Many times, accidents don't wait for doctors to arrive in this territory." Within minutes, they were heading toward the Miller farm, the buggy moving as fast as Thomas dared push it over the rough terrain. Eleanor sat beside him, her medical bag clutched firmly in her lap, her earlier finery now merely the backdrop for her true purpose. The Miller farm appeared on the horizon, a modest homestead with fields of wheat stretching toward the mountains. Smoke rose from the chimney, and several horses were tethered outside, indicating Dr. Parker had already arrived. Sarah Miller met them at the door, her face pale with worry. "Thank God you've come. The doctor's with him now, but Jamie's in such pain." "I'll help," Eleanor assured her, already moving toward the back bedroom where pained cries could be heard. "Thomas, I'll need hot water and clean cloths." Thomas nodded, following Sarah to the kitchen while Eleanor proceeded to the injured boy. The domesticity of heating water and gathering linens felt strangely appropriate, supporting Eleanor's work in the most practical way he could. When he brought the requested items to the bedroom, he found Dr. Parker setting the boy's leg while Eleanor administered drops from one of her bottles into the child's mouth. Jamie Miller couldn't have been more than 10, his face white with pain, despite Eleanor's medication. "Hold him steady," Parker instructed Thomas. "This will hurt, but it must be done properly." Thomas moved to the head of the bed, placing firm but gentle hands on the boy's shoulders. "Deep breaths, Jamie," he encouraged, "just like when you're taking aim at a target." The boy's terrified eyes fixed on him, recognizing the shooting champion from the competition earlier. "Did you win today, Mr. Blackwood?" "I did," Thomas confirmed, deliberately keeping his voice calm as Parker prepared to set the bone. Thanks. Do a trick my father taught me about breathing. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Want to try it with me? Jamie nodded weakly, and they began breathing in unison. Thomas kept the boy's attention on his face, away from what Parker was doing with the injured leg. Eleanor moved to stand beside the doctor, her hands steady as she prepared a poultice for after the setting. Now, Jamie, Thomas said quietly, when I count to 3, I want you to breathe out as hard as you can, like you're blowing out every candle on a birthday cake. 1, 2. On 3, Parker snapped the bone into a place. Jamie's scream was muffled by his forceful exhale, his body arching against Thomas's restraining hands. Eleanor immediately stepped forward with her tincture, administering another dose that would help with both pain and shock. Well done, she murmured to the boy, her voice gentle in a way Thomas had never heard before. The worst is over now. As Parker prepared splints and bandages, Eleanor applied her poultice to the swollen area, explaining to Sarah Miller how to change it and when to administer more of the pain tincture. Thomas stepped back, watching this side of Eleanor with growing admiration. Confident, knowledgeable, genuinely caring. Will he be all right? John Miller asked from the doorway, his weather-beaten face creased with worry. With proper care, yes, Parker assured him. The bone was clean, and Mrs. Blackwood's remedies will help with both pain and healing. John Miller looked at Eleanor with open gratitude. We can't thank you enough, Mrs. Blackwood. Whatever your fee— There's no fee, Eleanor interrupted, gently. Neighbors help neighbors. The simple statement hung in the air, weighted with meaning. The Millers weren't wealthy, and medical care could often mean the difference between surviving the season or losing everything. I insist on something, Miller pressed. Perhaps some of our wheat when it's harvested. If you insist, Eleanor conceded with a small smile. A small sack for bread flour would be appreciated. As they prepared to leave, Sarah Miller pressed a jar of preserved peaches into Eleanor's hands. For now, she insisted. Jamie picked them himself last summer. Outside, as Thomas helped Eleanor into the buggy, Dr. Parker approached them. That was good work in there, he acknowledged, his professional reserve softening slightly. The boy would have suffered much more without your tincture. Eleanor nodded, accepting the rare compliment from her usual rival. Your setting was clean. He should heal well if infection doesn't set in. Parker hesitated, then added, perhaps we might discuss your willow bark formula sometime for my more difficult cases. Thomas watched as Eleanor considered this. Olive branch from the man who had often dismissed her as a mere herb woman. I'd be pleased to, she finally replied. Stop by when you're next near Blackwood Ridge. As they drove away, Thomas glanced at Eleanor's profile in the fading afternoon light. You were remarkable in there. Eleanor looked surprised at the compliment. I only did what needed doing. Not everyone can, Thomas pointed out, or would. The Millers will remember that you came when they needed help, not when it was convenient or profitable. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. In my experience, that's when most people need help, at the inconvenient times. They continued in companionable silence, the shared experience having shifted something between them. Eleanor had revealed a core part of herself, not the witch of rumors or the dutiful wife of appearances, but a healer with genuine skill and compassion. As Blackwood Ridge came into view, Thomas noticed dark clouds gathering on the horizon, the kind that often heralded summer storms in the territory. Looks like rain coming, he observed. Much needed with this drought. Eleanor followed his gaze to the distant thunderheads. Yes, though lightning without sufficient rain brings its own dangers. Thomas nodded, understanding the reference to fire, the rancher's perpetual fear during dry seasons. We should check the lightning rods on the outbuildings tomorrow. Make sure everything's secure. They reached the guest house just as the first distant rumbles of thunder echoed across the valley. Eleanor immediately set about organizing her depleted medical supplies, making notes of what needed replenishing. "I need to gather more yarrow," she murmured almost to herself, "and the willow bark is running low." Thomas removed his jacket, watching her methodical movements. "I could help you collect what you need. There's a stand of willows near the North Creek that might serve." Eleanor glanced up, genuine surprise on her face. "You'd do that? Why not?" Thomas shrugged. "I know the land, you know the plants. Seems practical." A smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Practical indeed, Mr. Blackwood." The domestic moment was interrupted by an urgent knock at the door. Thomas opened it to find Pete, one of the senior ranch hands, his expression grave beneath, his rain-dampened hat. "Mr. Blackwood, sorry to disturb you and the missus, but there's trouble brewing. Got word that some of our cattle have broken through the south fence, the section near Bennett property. Your father's organizing men to round them up before the storm hits full force." Thomas nodded, already reaching for his coat. "I'll saddle up immediately." Pete hesitated, glancing at Eleanor. "There's more, sir. Sheriff Hayes stopped by the main house, says there's word of cattle rustlers working this area, targeting herds during storms when visibility's poor." Eleanor stepped forward. "How many cattle got loose?" "About 30 head, ma'am. Yearlings mostly, from the look of tracks." Thomas frowned. "That's not a random break. Someone cut that fence deliberately." "Your father thinks the same," Pete confirmed grimly. "He's got rifles being distributed now." Eleanor's expression grew concerned. "In a thunderstorm, with limited visibility and armed men. That's dangerous." "Cattle theft is serious business," Pete replied with a shrug. "I'll be careful," Thomas assured Eleanor, buckling on his gun belt. "Stay here, keep the doors locked. With rustlers about—" I'm coming with you," Eleanor interrupted, already reaching for her own coat. Thomas stared at her. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. I know that valley better than most of your men," Eleanor countered. "And I can track in conditions they can't. My father taught me." "This isn't collecting herbs, Eleanor. There could be armed thieves." "All the more reason to have someone who knows every hiding place and trail," she insisted. "Besides, if the storm breaks fully, you may need my help with injuries." Thomas wanted to argue further, but the determined set of Eleanor's jaw told him it would be futile. And she had a point. Her knowledge of Pine Valley could prove invaluable, especially if the cattle had scattered into the more remote areas. "Fine," he conceded reluctantly, "but you stay close to me, and if there's any sign of danger, you retreat immediately." Eleanor nodded her agreement, already changing from her Founder's Day dress into more practical attire. Thomas noticed she moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to responding to emergencies. No wasted motion, no unnecessary concerns. Within minutes, they were riding toward the south pasture, the sky darkening ominously above them. Thomas on his stallion and Eleanor on a steady mare from the Blackwood stables. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall as they joined the group of ranch hands already assembled near the main house. Jackson Blackwood sat astride his horse at the center of the group, issuing directions with the authority of a general commanding troops. He frowned at the sight of Eleanor. "This is no place for a woman," he said sharply as they approached. "Mrs. Blackwood knows the valley better than any of us," Thomas replied before Eleanor could speak. "And she's a skilled tracker." Jackson's eyebrows rose. "Is she indeed? Well, we need all the help we can get before this storm worsens." He turned to address the assembled men. "We've got rustlers cutting fences and 30 head moving toward Pine Valley. Likely they're planning to drive them through the narrow pass to the eastern lowlands. We need to intercept before they reach it." "The eastern pass will be treacherous in this weather," Eleanor observed. "There's a better route they might take, through Hawks Hollow. It's less known, but more protected from the storm." "Jackson, regarded her with surprise and suspicion. "And you know this hollow?" "My father and I hunted deer there," Eleanor confirmed. "There's a natural spring halfway through that would let them water the cattle before continuing east." A flash of lightning illuminated the sky, followed by a growl of thunder that seemed to settle in the bones. The rain began to fall more heavily, driven by gusts of wind that bent the tall grass of the pastures. Jackson considered Eleanor's information, clearly weighing his distrust against the practical value of her knowledge. "Pete, take 4 men and check the eastern pass. Thomas, you take your wife and 3 others to this hollow. The rest will spread out along the valley floor. Anyone finding the rustlers fires 3 shots in the air. Do not engage alone. These men are desperate and armed." The group separated, heading in their assigned directions. Thomas led his small contingent toward the southeast, following Eleanor's guidance as they entered the more rugged terrain that marked the boundary between Blackwood and Bennett land. "The hollow is just beyond that ridge," Eleanor shouted over the intensifying storm, pointing toward a rocky outcropping. "There's a trail wide enough for cattle if you know where to look." They dismounted to lead their horses along a narrow path that curved between towering rock formations. The rain had become a deluge, reducing visibility to mere yards and turning the ground treacherous with mud. Lightning cracked overhead, startlingly close, illuminating the landscape in harsh white flashes. Not ideal tracking weather. One of the ranch hands muttered. "Wait!" Eleanor called, stopping suddenly. She knelt, examining something on the ground that was nearly invisible in the poor light. "Cattle passed here recently. The rain hasn't washed away all the tracks." Thomas crouched beside her, impressed by her ability to read signs he could barely see. "How many?" "Hard to tell exactly," Eleanor admitted, "but at least 20 head. And, She moved a few paces forward, examining another mark in the mud. "Boot prints, at least 3 men." Thomas nodded grimly. "We're on the right trail." He turned to the ranch hands. "Roberts, go back and try to signal the others. Henderson, Fletcher, you're with us." As Roberts departed, the remaining 4 continued along the increasingly narrow path. The hollow appeared ahead, a protected passage between steep rock walls that provided some shelter from the driving rain. They moved cautiously now, aware that the rustlers could be just ahead. "There's a bend about 50 yards ahead," Eleanor whispered to Thomas. "The spring is just beyond it. If they're watering the cattle, that's where they'll be." Thomas nodded, drawing his revolver. "Henderson, circle wide to the left. Fletcher to the right. Try to get eyes on them without being seen. Eleanor, stay here." Eleanor frowned. "You need me to identify the spring location." "Be pointed out from here," Thomas insisted. "Please, Eleanor, I can't focus if I'm worried about you." Something in his tone must have conveyed his genuine concern, because Eleanor nodded reluctantly. "Just past those twin boulders, there's a dip in the ground where water collects. The cattle will be gathered there." "Oh," Thomas squeezed her shoulder briefly, the gesture both gratitude and reassurance, before moving forward with cautious steps. The rain provided some cover for his approach, muffling sounds and limiting visibility for the rustlers as well. As he neared the bend in the hollow, he could hear the lowing of cattle and the low murmur of men's voices. Easing forward, he peered around the rock wall to assess the situation. Just as Eleanor had predicted, the stolen cattle were clustered around a natural spring, drinking deeply. 3 men moved among them, driving any stragglers back to the group. All were armed, rifles slung across their backs, pistols at their hips. Thomas recognized none of them, suggesting they were not local men, but professional rustlers who moved from territory to territory. Henderson appeared at the opposite side of the hollow, catching Thomas's eye and holding up 3 fingers to confirm the count. Thomas nodded, then signaled for Henderson to wait for his move. The plan was forming in Thomas's mind. They were evenly matched in numbers, but had the advantage of surprise. If they could disarm the rustlers without gunfire that might stampede the cattle, they could resolve this with minimal risk. A sudden flash of lightning followed by an immediate crash of thunder changed everything. The cattle, already nervous, began to shift and bellow in distress. One of the rustlers shouted a warning, and the men began hurriedly trying to move the herd before the animals panicked completely. Thomas realized their window of opportunity was closing. "Blackwood Ranch!" he shouted, stepping into view with his revolver raised. "Drop your weapons!" The rustlers reacted with practiced speed, diving for cover and drawing their guns. Gunfire erupted, bullets ricocheting off the rock walls of the hollow. The cattle, now truly panicked, began to stampede, creating chaos in the confined space. Thomas fired twice, forcing one of the rustlers back behind a boulder. Henderson and Fletcher added their fire from their positions, creating a crossfire that kept the thieves pinned down. "Give it up," Thomas called. "You're surrounded." A bullet whizzed past his ear in reply, too close for comfort. He ducked, lower behind his cover, trying to keep track of both the rustlers and the increasingly dangerous movement of the frightened cattle. A scream of pain cut through the noise of the storm and stampede. Fletcher, caught by a stray bullet or kicked by a panicked steer. Thomas couldn't see him through the confusion of rain and cattle, but the sound told him the injury was serious. Another lightning strike illuminated the scene in stark relief. Cattle running in terror, rustlers using the confusion to mount their horses, Fletcher lying motionless on the ground. Thomas fired at the escaping men, but between the rain, the darkness and the chaos, accurate shooting was nearly impossible. "Thomas!" Eleanor's voice called from behind him. She had disobeyed his order to stay back, moving toward Fletcher's fallen form with her medical bag clutched to her chest. "Eleanor! Get back!" Thomas shouted, fear for her safety making his voice harsh. But Eleanor continued forward, ducking low and moving with surprising agility through the edges of the stampeding herd. Thomas cursed, firing another shot toward the retreating rustlers before moving to intercept her. "He's bleeding badly," Eleanor called as Thomas reached her side. "Help me move him to shelter." Together, they dragged Fletcher's unconscious form behind a large boulder, out of the path of the cattle and protected from the worst of the rain. Blood soaked the front of his shirt, a bullet wound to the upper chest that pumped crimson with each faint heartbeat. Eleanor worked with swift efficiency, cutting away the shirt and examining the wound by the light of Henderson's hastily produced lantern. "The bullet's still in there," she reported grimly, "and it's close to the lung. We need to get him to proper shelter immediately." "The rustlers?" Henderson asked, keeping watch with his rifle ready. "Gone," Thomas confirmed bitterly. "With the cattle. We'll track them when the storm passes, but Fletcher is the priority now." They fashioned a makeshift stretcher from their coats and branches, securing Fletcher as best they could for the difficult journey back to Blackwood Ridge. The rain continued to pound them, turning the already treacherous path into a slippery nightmare. "My cabin is closer," Eleanor said as they struggled with the stretcher. "The old Bennett place. We need to get him warm and dry as quickly as possible." Thomas nodded his agreement. "Lead the way." Eleanor guided them through the storm with unerring confidence, taking shortcuts through the valley that Thomas wouldn't have known existed. It occurred to him that she had spent her entire life learning this land, understanding its contours and secrets in ways that even the Blackwoods, for all their dominance, did not. Pine Valley emerged from the stormy darkness, the Bennett cabin a welcome sight with its solid walls and promise of shelter. Henderson hurried ahead to open the door, while Thomas and Eleanor carefully maneuvered the stretcher. Inside, the cabin was dusty but intact. Eleanor immediately began issuing directions, her focus entirely on the injured man. "Get a fire started in the hearth. There should be dry wood in the box. Henderson, Find extra blankets in the chest by the wall. Thomas, help me get him onto the bed. They worked together seamlessly, each following Eleanor's calm, authoritative instructions without question. Thomas marveled at the transformation. This was not the quiet, reserved woman who had reluctantly married him just days ago. This was someone in her element, confident and commanding. As the fire caught and began to warm the cabin, Eleanor cleaned the wound and prepared her instruments. "I need to remove the bullet," she said grimly, "or he won't survive the night." "Shouldn't we wait for Dr. Parker?" Henderson asked nervously. Eleanor shook her head. "No time, and the storm would prevent him reaching us anyway." She looked up at Thomas, her eyes steady. "I need your help. You'll have to hold him still." Thomas nodded, positioning himself at Fletcher's shoulders. "I'm ready." The procedure that followed tested them both. Fletcher regained consciousness as Eleanor probed for the bullet, his screams echoing in the small cabin despite the willowbark tincture she had administered. Thomas held him firmly, murmuring reassurances as Eleanor worked with focused precision. When the bullet finally came free, Fletcher had mercifully passed out again. Eleanor cleaned and packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow and other herbs. Thomas didn't recognize, then bound it tightly with clean bandages. "Will he make it?" Thomas asked quietly as they watched Fletcher's shallow breathing. "If infection doesn't set in," Eleanor replied, washing blood from her hands in a basin. "The next day will tell." Henderson had fallen asleep in a chair by the fire, exhausted by the night's events. Outside, the storm continued unabated, lightning occasionally illuminating the cabin through the small windows. Thomas realized he was shivering, his clothes soaked through from the rain and struggle. Eleanor noticed too, her healer's instincts still alert. "You need to get dry," she said practically. "There might be some of my father's old clothes in the trunk by the bed." Thomas nodded gratefully, finding a worn but clean shirt and trousers that were only slightly too small. He changed in the small back room, returning to find Eleanor had also located dry clothing for herself, a simple dress that showed signs of frequent mending. "You should rest," she told him, checking Fletcher's pulse once more. "I'll keep watch for a while." "I'm not sure I could sleep," Thomas admitted, though exhaustion pulled at his limbs. Eleanor studied him for a moment, then moved to a cabinet and retrieved a small bottle. "2 drops of this in water," she offered. "It will help without leaving you insensible if you're needed." Thomas accepted the tincture gratefully, adding it to a cup of water warmed by the fire. The herbal taste was bitter, but not unpleasant. He settled into the room's only other chair, watching as Eleanor tended to Fletcher with gentle, competent hands. "You're very good at this," he observed quietly. Eleanor glanced up briefly. "I've had practice. Too much, perhaps." "How did you learn? Beyond what your father taught you?" She was silent for a moment, rearranging the blanket over Fletcher's still form. "There was an old woman who lived near here when I was a girl, Mrs. Whitecrow, half Crow, half French. She knew every plant and its purpose. People called her a witch too." "She taught you?" Eleanor nodded. "For 3 years until she died. She said I had the gift, not magic as some claimed, but the ability to see what plants could do, to understand their language." A faint smile touched her lips. "My father encouraged it, even when neighbors whispered. He said useful knowledge was never wrong, no matter its source." "He sounds like a wise man," Thomas murmured, feeling the tincture beginning to work. His thoughts growing softer at the edges. He was stubborn too, like another man I'm coming to know. Their eyes met across the small room, the firelight casting warm shadows that softened Eleanor's features and illuminated something in her expression that Thomas hadn't seen before. A gentle teasing, perhaps even affection. "Rest, Thomas," she said softly. "I'll wake you if there's any change." As Thomas drifted towards sleep, lulled by the fire's warmth and Eleanor's remedy, His last conscious thought was of how naturally she had spoken his name, not Mr. Blackwood, not with formality or reserve, but with the ease of someone who belonged in his life. And in that moment, on the edge of sleep in a storm-battered cabin, with danger and uncertainty all around them, Thomas Blackwood realized that he was glad, truly deeply glad, that Eleanor Bennett had become Eleanor Blackwood. Dawn broke with fragile sunlight filtering through the cabin windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-clean world and the gentle drip of rainwater from eaves and tree branches. Thomas woke with a stiff neck from sleeping in the chair, momentarily disoriented until the events of the previous night rushed back to him. Fletcher lay on the bed, his breathing steadier than before, a sheen of sweat on his brow that Eleanor was gently wiping away. She looked exhausted but alert, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she had maintained her vigil throughout the night. "You didn't wake me," Thomas said, his voice rough with sleep. Eleanor glanced up. "You needed rest, and he's been stable." Thomas rose, stretching his cramped muscles. "How is he?" "Better than I expected," Eleanor admitted. "The fever broke an hour ago. If we can keep the wound clean and get some broth into him today, he has a good chance." Henderson was already up, stoking the fire and heating water. He nodded respectfully to Thomas. "Morning, boss. Figure we should get word back to the ranch that we're alive. They'll be worried after that storm." Thomas agreed. "Can you make the ride? Eleanor and I should stay with Fletcher until he's stronger." "I'll head out as soon as it's light enough to see the trails clearly," Henderson confirmed. "Anything else you need from the ranch?" Thomas considered. "Tell my father what happened with the rustlers, and ask Mrs. Collins to send fresh bandages and whatever food can be spared. We may be here a day or two." As Henderson prepared to depart, Thomas joined Eleanor by Fletcher's bedside. The wounded man's eyes flickered open, confusion evident in his gaze. "You're at the Bennett place," Thomas explained gently. "You were shot during the rustler confrontation. Mrs. Blackwood removed the bullet and has been treating you." Fletcher's eyes moved to Eleanor, recognition slowly dawning. "The witch," he mumbled. Thomas tensed, but Eleanor merely smiled faintly. "The healer," she corrected, helping him sip water from a cup. "And you're lucky the bullet missed your lung by less than an inch." "Thank you, Ma'am," Fletcher managed, before drifting back to sleep. Eleanor checked his bandages once more, then stood with a barely concealed wince. Thomas noticed her stiffness immediately. "You need rest," he said firmly. "I'll watch him. Here for a while." Eleanor looked about to protest, then seemed to recognize the sense in his words. "Wake me if his fever returns or if the wound begins to seep," she instructed, moving toward the small settee across the room. "Take the back room," Thomas suggested. "The bed in there is small, but better than this furniture." Eleanor nodded gratefully and disappeared into the cabin's second room. Thomas settled into the chair she had vacated, studying Fletcher's sleeping face and considering the night's events. The rustlers had escaped with the cattle, a significant loss to Blackwood Ranch, but one that paled in comparison to what might have been lost had Eleanor not been there. He thought about how naturally she had taken command of the crisis, her knowledge and calm authority saving Fletcher's life when panic or indecision would have cost it. Thomas had seen many competent people in his life, ranch hands skilled with horses, trackers who could read sign in near darkness, his father's ruthless business acumen. But Eleanor's quiet capability impressed him in a different way. Hers wasn't a skill meant for profit or power, but for preserving life. The morning passed quietly. Thomas tended the fire, checked on Fletcher periodically, and explored the small cabin that had been Eleanor's home. It was modest, but meticulously maintained, with shelves of books suggesting a mind hungry for knowledge despite isolation. Pressed flowers were framed on the walls, alongside simple sketches of plants labeled in neat handwriting. It was a home of purpose and care, not the dwelling of a bitter recluse, as town gossip had suggested. In the early afternoon, Fletcher woke, properly, lucid enough to take broth and express embarrassed gratitude for the care he'd received. "Never thought I'd be doctored by the Bennett witch," he admitted sheepishly. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Blackwood. You'd be wise to reconsider that name for my wife," Thomas replied mildly but firmly. "Particularly since her skills saved your life." Fletcher looked properly chastened. "Yes, sir. Mrs. Blackwood, I meant. She's got a touch with medicine, that's certain." "That she does," Thomas agreed, helping the wounded man sit up slightly. "Rest now. We'll return to the ranch when you're stronger." Eleanor emerged from the back room around mid-afternoon, looking refreshed despite the circumstances. She checked Fletcher's wound with practiced hands, nodding with satisfaction at its clean appearance. "The yarrow poultice is working well," she observed. "Another day of rest and we can likely move him by wagon." As she worked, Thomas noticed how Fletcher watched her, the wariness fading into something like respect as she explained the treatment and what to expect during healing. It was a small shift, but significant. Henderson should have reached the ranch by now, Thomas noted, as they shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread Eleanor had prepared. "I expect we'll have visitors before nightfall." Eleanor nodded, her expression turning thoughtful. "Your father will be angry about the cattle." "Yes," Thomas acknowledged, "though losing 30 head won't break us. The rustlers escaping with impunity is what will gall him most." "He'll blame me," Eleanor said matter-of-factly, "for suggesting Hawk's Hollow." Thomas shook his head firmly. "You were right about their route. Without your knowledge, we wouldn't have found them at all, and Fletcher might have died without your care. Logic rarely factors into your father's judgments where I'm concerned," Eleanor pointed out with a wry smile. Before Thomas could respond, the sound of approaching horses caught their attention. He moved to the window, relieved to see Henderson returning with 2 wagons, one presumably for transporting Fletcher, the other loaded with supplies. Thomas's relief faded when he recognized his father's distinctive figure on horseback at the head of the small procession. "My father's come himself," he warned Eleanor, "with wagons and men." Eleanor smoothed her borrowed dress, squaring her shoulders slightly. "Well then, let's receive them properly." They stepped outside together as the riders approached. Jackson Blackwood surveyed the Bennett cabin with thinly veiled contempt before dismounting with the fluid grace that belied his age. "Thomas," he acknowledged with a nod. "Mrs. Blackwood, Henderson gave us quite the tale of rustlers, gunfire, and makeshift surgery." His gaze sharpened on Eleanor. "Apparently, we owe Fletcher's survival to your herbs, to Mrs. Blackwood's medical skill," Thomas corrected firmly. "She removed the bullet and treated the wound when no doctor was available." Jackson's expression remained skeptical. "Indeed, and the rustlers escaped eastward with the cattle," Thomas reported. "The storm and Fletcher's injury made pursuit impossible. I suggest sending men to alert neighboring ranches. If we coordinate—" "Already done," Jackson interrupted. "I've got men checking all the passes and trading posts within 100 miles. Those cattle won't reach market without us knowing." He turned his attention to the cabin, eyeing it with calculated interest. "So this is the famous Bennett homestead, smaller than I expected." He moved toward the door. "Let's see what all the fuss has been about all these years." Thomas and Eleanor exchanged glances before following him inside. Jackson stalked through the main room, taking in the modest furnishings, the books, the carefully organized shelves. Of medicines, Fletcher attempted to sit straighter when the ranch owner approached his bedside. "Sir," he acknowledged weakly. Jackson examined the wounded man briefly. "You'll live, Fletcher. Thanks to quick thinking, from what Henderson tells me." His gaze shifted to Eleanor with reluctant acknowledgement. Convenient that you had your remedies with you, Mrs. Blackwood. I always carry basic supplies, Eleanor replied evenly, particularly when riding into potential danger. Jackson continued his inspection of the cabin, pausing at a framed survey map on the wall. Isaac's work, he noted. He was a good surveyor, whatever else I thought of him. He was a good man, Eleanor said quietly, with principles that weren't for sale. The pointed comment hung in the air between them. Jackson turned slowly, studying Eleanor with new intensity. "You're very direct for a new bride," he observed. "Would you prefer dishonesty, Mr. Blackwood?" A surprised chuckle escaped Jackson's lips. "I begin to see why my son defends you so readily." He moved to the window, looking out at the valley stretching below. "This land has potential, despite Isaac's mismanagement. With proper irrigation from the creek supports a delicate balance of wildlife and plants," Eleanor interrupted. "Diverting it would damage. Progress requires change, Mrs. Blackwood," Jackson cut in. "Sentimentality about a few flowers and deer doesn't build prosperity." Thomas stepped forward. "We're not discussing changes to Eleanor's land, Father. That wasn't part of our arrangement." Jackson's expression hardened. "Our arrangement, as you call it, was meant to bring Bennett land under Blackwood management. I fail to see how that's happening while you're playing house in this cabin." "We're here because a man nearly died," Thomas replied, keeping his voice level with effort. "And for now, Eleanor's land remains under her control as agreed." Father and son locked eyes in silent challenge. Thomas felt rather than saw Eleanor move to stand beside him, a subtle but clear declaration of alliance. After a tense moment, Jackson shifted tactics. "Very well, we'll table that discussion for another time." He gestured toward the door. "The wagons are ready. Fletcher should be moved to the ranch where Dr. Parker can monitor him properly." The activity of loading Fletcher onto the wagon and securing the cabin provided a welcome distraction from the underlying tension. Eleanor moved efficiently, gathering medicines she thought might be needed and locking the house that had been her home for so many years. As they prepared to depart, Thomas noticed her lingering gaze on the cabin. Not sentimental exactly, but acknowledging a transition. This place had been her sanctuary and her prison in many ways, the site of both independence and isolation. Now she was leaving it, perhaps not for the last time, but certainly marking the end of an era. "We can come back whenever you wish," he said quietly. "It's still your home." Eleanor looked up at him, something soft and surprised in her expression. "Thank you," she said simply. "But perhaps home isn't always about place." The meaning beneath her words settled into Thomas's consciousness as they joined the procession back to Blackwood Ridge. Something fundamental had shifted between them during the crisis, a trust born of shared purpose and mutual respect that transcended their arranged circumstances. The journey was slow due to Fletcher's condition, with frequent stops to check his comfort and administer more of Eleanor's pain tincture. Thomas noticed that even his father deferred to Eleanor's judgment regarding the wounded man's care, a reluctant acknowledgement of her expertise. They arrived at Blackwood Ridge as evening approached. Dr. Parker was waiting, having been summoned by Jackson earlier in the day. To Thomas's surprise, the doctor examined Fletcher's wound and treatment with professional interest rather than dismissal. "Clean work," he acknowledged to Eleanor as they transferred Fletcher to a proper bed in the bunkhouse. "Better than I might have managed under the circumstances. Your poultice recipe, would you be willing to share it?" Eleanor blinked, clearly surprised by the request. "Of course, it's primarily yarrow and echinacea, with additions that depend on the nature of the wound." Parker nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps we might compare notes sometime, for the benefit of patients." It was a small gesture, but a significant one, a professional olive branch from the established medical authority to the woman long dismissed as a mere herb gatherer. Thomas caught Eleanor's eye across the room, sharing a private moment of recognition for what this represented. The next morning brought a flurry of activity at Blackwood Ridge. News had spread quickly about the rustler incident, Fletcher's injury, and Eleanor's role in saving him. Thomas found himself fielding questions from curious ranch hands who suddenly viewed the Bennett witch in a new light. "Heard she dug that bullet out with just a knife and her bare hands," one young wrangler said with something like awe. "She used proper medical tools," Thomas corrected, "with skill and knowledge." "Still," the young man persisted, "ain't many women, or men for that matter, who could keep their head like that. Reckon we misjudged her some." The sentiment seemed to be spreading. When Thomas and Eleanor visited Fletcher in the bunkhouse, later that day, several ranch hands nodded respectfully to her, one even removing his hat as she passed. The transformation wasn't universal. Some still watched her with suspicion, but the tide of opinion was clearly shifting. Dr. Parker's presence added further legitimacy to Eleanor's standing. His willingness to consult with her on Fletcher's ongoing treatment signaled to the community that her skills deserved recognition. "Your herbal knowledge is impressive," Parker admitted as they changed Fletcher's bandages together, "particularly your pain management techniques. I've patients who might benefit from alternatives to laudanum." "I'd be happy to prepare some tinctures for your practice," Eleanor offered. "With proper dosage instructions, of course." Parker nodded, a hint of a smile breaking through his professional reserve. "A collaboration, then, for the good of our patients." The exchange was witnessed by several ranch hands, further cementing Eleanor's new status as a respected healer rather than a suspicious outsider. Thomas watched the interaction with satisfaction, pleased to see Eleanor receiving the recognition she deserved. The real test came 3 days later, when Martha Jenkins arrived at the guest house, her youngest daughter Emily in tow. The girls, pale face and labored breathing, indicated another bout of the respiratory ailment that had plagued her for years. "Mrs. Blackwood," Martha began awkwardly, "I know we haven't always been, that is, there's been talk." "How long has Emily been coughing?" Eleanor asked gently, cutting through the woman's discomfort to focus on the child. Relief flooded Martha's face at the direct approach. 3 days now. Dr. Parker's powders aren't helping this time, and he mentioned your syrup might—" "Of course," Eleanor said, inviting them inside. "I have some prepared. Let me examine Emily first to make sure it's suitable." Thomas excused himself to give them privacy, but not before noticing the mixture of hope and lingering wariness on Martha Jenkins' face. The woman had been one of the most active in spreading witch rumors about Eleanor, yet here she was, seeking help for her beloved child. When he returned an hour later, he found a transformed atmosphere. Emily was breathing more easily, sipping tea with honey while Martha and Eleanor discussed treatment options with the comfortable rapport of concerned caregivers rather than suspicious strangers. "You must come to our Sunday dinner next week," Martha was saying as Thomas entered. "Many of the families would welcome a chance to properly meet Mrs. Blackwood, the real Mrs. Blackwood, not the rumors." Eleanor glanced up at Thomas, surprise and something like happiness brightening her eyes. "That would be lovely, wouldn't it, Thomas?" "Indeed," he agreed, touched by the genuine pleasure in her expression. "We'd be honored to accept." After the Jenkins departed with medicine and detailed instructions, Eleanor stood in the doorway watching them go, a thoughtful expression on her face. "That can't have been easy for her," she observed, "coming to the witch for help. Love for her child outweighed her prejudice," Thomas replied, standing beside her. "That's a powerful force." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Perhaps people can change their minds when given reason." "People respect capability and courage," Thomas said. "You've demonstrated both." A faint blush colored Eleanor's cheeks at the compliment. "It feels strange," being seen differently after so long as an outsider. How does it feel? Thomas asked, genuinely curious. Eleanor considered this. Like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow, warming but almost too bright at first. The poetry of the description struck Thomas, another glimpse of the thoughtful, perceptive woman beneath the practical exterior. You deserve the sunlight, Eleanor. Their eyes met, a moment of understanding passing between them that went beyond words. Then Eleanor smiled, a real smile that transformed her face and reached her eyes. "So do you, Thomas Blackwood," she said quietly. "So do you." The days that followed brought a steady stream of visitors to the guest house. Ranch hands inquiring about remedies for various ailments, women from town tentatively seeking Eleanor's advice. Even Dr. Parker, arriving with medical journals to discuss treatment approaches. The Winter Witch was gradually being replaced by Mrs. Blackwood the healer in the community's consciousness. Jackson Blackwood observed this transformation with calculating interest. Thomas often caught his father watching Eleanor as she moved about the ranch, his expression a mixture of reluctant respect and strategic assessment. "Your wife is making quite the impression," Jackson remarked one afternoon as they reviewed cattle counts in the main house study. "Quite a change from the reclusive Bennett spinster." "Eleanor was always this person," Thomas replied evenly. "People simply weren't looking properly." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "And you were? I seem to recall you were less than enthusiastic about this marriage." Thomas considered his response carefully. "I made assumptions based on gossip and prejudice. I was wrong." Jackson studied his son with new interest. "And now, how do you find married life with the former Miss Bennett?" The question was loaded with implications and potential traps. Thomas chose honesty, though not complete transparency. "I find Eleanor to be intelligent, capable, and principled. Our arrangement has proven more compatible than I anticipated." "Compatible," Jackson repeated with a knowing look. An interesting choice of word for a marriage. Thomas met his father's gaze directly. "What would you prefer I say?" "Perhaps that your wife has proven useful," Jackson suggested. "Her medical skills, her knowledge of Bennett land, assets to the Blackwood interests." "Eleanor is not an asset," Thomas said firmly. "She's my wife and a person of considerable worth, independent of any benefit to the ranch." Jackson leaned back in his chair, truly surprised by the vehemence in his son's tone. Well, it seems Mrs. Blackwood has accomplished what I thought impossible, giving my dutiful son opinions of his own." "I've always had opinions, Father," Thomas replied. "I've just learned recently that expressing them can be worthwhile." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the study door. Mrs. Collins entered, her usually composed features showing uncharacteristic excitement. "Mr. Blackwood, there's news from town," she announced. "The stagecoach just brought word. The Railroad Commission is arriving next week to make final decisions about the route. There's to be a town meeting Thursday, next to hear local perspectives." Jackson straightened, instantly alert. "Excellent. Thomas, we'll need to prepare our presentation on the benefits of the southeastern route, the one that would require a depot near our main grazing lands. And run through Eleanor's property," Thomas noted. Jackson waved a dismissive hand. "A minor consideration. The economic benefits to the entire territory will certainly be weighed alongside environmental impacts and water access issues," Thomas interrupted smoothly. "I'm sure Eleanor will have valuable insights to contribute at the meeting." His father's expression darkened. "This is hardly a matter for—" "My wife has as much right to speak at the town meeting as any landowner," Thomas stated firmly. "More than most, given her family's long history with the valley." Jackson studied his son for a long moment, reassessing the man before him. "You've changed, Thomas." "Perhaps I've simply found my voice," Thomas replied, "something Eleanor has helped me recognize." The town meeting became the focus of conversation throughout Silver Creek and surrounding homesteads. The railroad's arrival promised economic transformation for the remote territory, bringing both opportunity and concern to the diverse community of ranchers, farmers, and merchants. For the Blackwoods, it represented a complex intersection of interests. Jackson saw the railroad as a chance to expand his cattle operation and cement his dominance in the region. Thomas, increasingly influenced by Eleanor's perspective, recognized both the benefits and potential costs to the land and smaller landholders. Jackson Blackwood observed this transformation with calculating interest. Thomas often caught his father watching Eleanor as she moved about the ranch, his expression a mixture of reluctant respect and strategic assessment. "Your wife is making quite the impression," Jackson remarked one afternoon as they reviewed cattle counts in the main house study. "Quite a change from the reclusive Bennett spinster." "Eleanor was always this person," Thomas replied evenly. "People simply weren't looking properly." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "And you were? I seem to recall you were less than enthusiastic about this marriage." Thomas considered his response carefully. "I made assumptions based on gossip and prejudice. I was wrong." Jackson studied his son with new interest. "And now, how do you find married life with the former Miss Bennett?" The question was loaded with implications and potential traps. Thomas chose honesty, though not complete transparency. "I find Eleanor to be intelligent, capable, and principled. Our arrangement has proven more compatible than I anticipated." "Compatible," Jackson repeated with a knowing look. "An interesting choice of word for a marriage." Thomas met his father's gaze directly. "What would you prefer I say?" "Perhaps that your wife has proven useful," Jackson suggested. "Her medical skills, her knowledge of Bennett land, assets to the Blackwood interests." "Eleanor is not an asset," Thomas said firmly. "She's my wife and a person of considerable worth, independent of any benefit to the ranch." Jackson leaned back in his chair, truly surprised by the vehemence in his son's tone. Well, it seems Mrs. Blackwood has accomplished what I thought impossible, giving my dutiful son opinions of his own." "I've always had opinions, Father," Thomas replied. "I've just learned recently that expressing them can be worthwhile." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the study door. Mrs. Collins entered, her usually composed features showing uncharacteristic excitement. "Mr. Blackwood, there's news from town," she announced. "The stagecoach just brought word. The Railroad Commission is arriving next week to make final decisions about the route. There's to be a town meeting Thursday, next to hear local perspectives." Jackson straightened, instantly alert. "Excellent. Thomas, we'll need to prepare our presentation on the benefits of the southeastern route, the one that would require a depot near our main grazing lands. And run through Eleanor's property," Thomas noted. Jackson waved a dismissive hand. "A minor consideration. The economic benefits to the entire territory will certainly be weighed alongside environmental impacts and water access issues," Thomas interrupted smoothly. "I'm sure Eleanor will have valuable insights to contribute at the meeting." His father's expression darkened. "This is hardly a matter for—" "My wife has as much right to speak at the town meeting as any landowner," Thomas stated firmly. "More than most, given her family's long history with the valley." Jackson studied his son for a long moment, reassessing the man before him. "You've changed, Thomas." "Perhaps I've simply found my voice," Thomas replied, "something Eleanor has helped me recognize." The town meeting became the focus of conversation throughout Silver Creek and surrounding homesteads. The railroad's arrival promised economic transformation for the remote territory, bringing both opportunity and concern to the diverse community of ranchers, farmers, and merchants. For the Blackwoods, it represented a complex intersection of interests. Jackson saw the railroad as a chance to expand his cattle operation and cement his dominance in the region. Thomas, increasingly influenced by Eleanor's perspective, recognized both the benefits and potential costs to the land and smaller landholders. The sheriff cleared his throat uncomfortably, like a man who's found something he didn't know he was missing. The observation hit uncomfortably close to truth Thomas had been avoiding acknowledging fully. Before he could formulate a response, Dr. Parker approached, drawing Eleanor into their conversation. Mrs. Blackwood and I were just discussing her fascinating work with willow bark extracts, Parker explained. I've begun recommending it to patients who find traditional pain medications too disorienting. A professional collaboration, Thomas asked, pleased by this further evidence of Eleanor's changing status. Indeed, Parker confirmed. Mrs. Blackwood has agreed to supply my practice with certain preparations, properly labeled and dosed, of course. Scientific accuracy combined with traditional knowledge, a powerful combination. Eleanor smiled, the expression transforming her face in a way that caught Thomas's breath. Dr. Parker brings valuable perspective as well. We're finding common ground in what matters most, helping people heal. As the evening progressed, Thomas found himself increasingly aware of how differently Eleanor was being received. What had begun as cautious curiosity was evolving into genuine respect and inclusion. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid the witch now sought her advice on children's ailments. Men who had dismissed her as an eccentric recluse listened attentively to her observations about local plants and conditions. Most striking to Thomas, however, was how naturally Eleanor stepped into this new role. There was no gloating over her changed status, no bitterness about past treatment. She moved through the social gathering with a quiet dignity that suggested she had always known her own worth, regardless of others' recognition of it. When they finally departed, the night air cool and refreshing after the crowded house, Thomas felt a strange mixture of pride and protective concern. "You were remarkable in there," he said as he helped Eleanor into the buggy. "It was unexpectedly pleasant," she admitted, settling her skirts, "though exhausting in its way. I've grown unaccustomed to so much conversation." Thomas took his place beside her, gathering the reins. Was it difficult, after years of being ostracized? Eleanor considered this as they began the journey home. Not difficult exactly, more surreal, like watching someone else living my life, a life I never expected to have. "Do you regret it?" Thomas asked, the question emerging before he could consider its implications. "The marriage that brought you into this new position." Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her profile illuminated by moonlight as she gazed across the darkened landscape. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but certain. "No, Thomas, I don't regret it." The simple statement hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Thomas felt something shift in his chest. Hope, perhaps, or the recognition of possibilities he had not allowed himself to consider fully. As Blackwood Ridge appeared on the horizon, its solid presence a reminder of all that had brought them together and all that still stood between them, Thomas made a decision. Whatever came next, the town meeting, his father's machinations, the future of the silver deposit, he would face it with Eleanor as a true partner, not merely an ally of convenience. The realization settled into his consciousness with the weight of truth long denied. Somewhere between duty and circumstance, between arranged marriage and grudging respect, Thomas Blackwood had begun to fall in love with his wife. The day of the town meeting arrived with a sense of anticipation that hung over Silver Creek like summer heat. By mid-afternoon, the modest town hall was filled beyond capacity. Ranchers, farmers, merchants, and homesteaders crowded together, their usual social divisions temporarily suspended by common interest in the railroad's fate. Thomas and Eleanor, arrived early, securing seats near the front where the railroad commissioners would present their plans. Jackson Blackwood entered shortly after, flanked by his most loyal ranch hands and business associates, his commanding presence drawing eyes and creating a ripple of whispers. When he spotted Thomas and Eleanor, he approached with measured steps, nodding curtly. "Son, Mrs. Blackwood, I trust you're prepared to support the family position on the southeastern route." Thomas met his father's gaze steadily. "We're here to listen to all perspectives and advocate for what's best for the entire territory." Jackson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The Blackwood interests are what's best for this territory. We've built everything worth having in this valley." "Not everything, Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor interjected quietly. "This land was thriving long before any of us claimed it." Before Jackson could retort, Sheriff Hayes called for order as the three railroad commissioners took their seats at the front table. The men wore the unmistakable look of Eastern authority. Crisp suits despite the frontier heat, pocket watches that gleamed in the afternoon light, expressions that revealed nothing of their thoughts. The lead commissioner, a silver-haired man named Harrington, outlined the purpose of the meeting with brisk efficiency. 2 potential routes had been surveyed. The southeastern path championed by Jackson Blackwood, cutting through Pine Valley and prime Blackwood grazing land, and the northeastern alternative that would skirt the more rugged terrain near Eagle's Bluff. "Our decision will balance economic viability with long-term sustainability," Harrington explained. "We invite landowners and community members to present relevant perspectives." Jackson Blackwood was first to speak, rising with the confidence of a man accustomed to being heard. His presentation was polished and persuasive. Statistics about cattle shipments, projected economic growth, employment opportunities. The southeastern route, he argued, would bring prosperity to the entire region while maximizing efficiency for the railroad. "Progress requires vision," he concluded, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. "The southeastern route represents that vision, the future of this territory built on strength and expansion rather than timidity." Murmurs of agreement followed his speech, particularly from the merchants who stood to gain most from increased commerce. Thomas felt Eleanor tense beside him as Jackson returned to his seat with the satisfied air of a man who had already won. When the commissioners called for additional perspectives, Eleanor rose gracefully. A hush fell over the room, many still, unaccustomed to seeing the former winter witch participating in community affairs, much less addressing a gathering of this importance. "My name is Eleanor Blackwood," she began, her voice clear and steady. "My family has lived in Pine Valley for 3 generations. I speak today not just as a landowner, but as someone who has studied the natural systems of this valley my entire life." She unfolded her father's survey maps, displaying them for the commissioners. "The southeastern route cuts through 3 crucial springs that feed our watershed. Diverting them would impact water access for dozens of homesteads downstream and alter the ecological balance that supports wildlife and plant life throughout the territory." A few dismissive snorts came from Jackson's supporters, but Eleanor continued undeterred. "However, my concern isn't merely environmental. It's practical, economics." She presented her cost analysis with methodical precision. The northeastern route crosses more stable geological formations, requiring less ongoing maintenance. Initial construction costs may be marginally higher, but over 20 years, the savings in repairs and reinforcement would be substantial. Thomas watched the commissioners lean forward, clearly intrigued by this unexpected analysis. Eleanor wasn't speaking as the eccentric herb woman, or even as his wife, but as a knowledgeable steward of the land with insights no one else possessed. "Furthermore," she continued, "the northeastern route would serve more diverse interests, connecting, Smaller farms and operations to markets while still accommodating larger ranches. A railroad that serves many rather than few will generate more traffic and revenue over time. When Eleanor finished, the room remained silent for a beat before erupting into overlapping conversations. Jackson Blackwood's face had darkened to a thunderous scowl. The commissioners huddled together, conferring in low voices while reviewing Eleanor's documents. As the meeting continued, other community members rose to speak, some supporting Jackson's position, others aligning with Eleanor's alternative. Thomas found himself studying his wife's profile as she listened attentively to each speaker, noting counter-arguments in the margins of her papers, ready to defend her position if challenged directly. When his turn came to address the gathering, Thomas felt a strange sense of clarity. For years, he had spoken as his father's son, the dutiful heir to Blackwood interests. Today, standing before the commissioners and his neighbors, he felt the weight of his own convictions. "I've spent my life on Blackwood land," he began. "I understand the importance of commerce and progress that my father emphasizes, but I've also come to appreciate the wisdom in my wife's perspective." He met Eleanor's surprised gaze briefly before continuing. "This territory's strength lies in its balance between development and preservation, between economic growth and sustainability. The northeastern route offers that balance." Jackson Blackwood rose abruptly, interrupting his son. "The Blackwood Ranch represents the largest economic force in this territory. Our support for the railroad comes with the clear understanding that our shipping needs will be prioritized." The implied threat hung in the air. "The southeastern route is the only acceptable option for our operation." Commissioner Harrington cleared his throat. "We appreciate your input, Mr. Blackwood, but our decision must weigh all factors. We'll take the next few days to review the information presented and announce our determination before departing." As the meeting adjourned, Thomas found himself separated from Eleanor by the crowd. He caught glimpses of her engaged in earnest conversation with the commissioners, her maps and documents spread between them. Pride swelled in his chest at her. Composure and conviction, Jackson Blackwood intercepted Thomas before he could rejoin his wife. "A word," he said tersely, steering his son outside, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street. "That was quite a performance," Jackson said once they were alone. "Publicly contradicting your father, supporting that woman's idealistic nonsense over family interests." "It wasn't a performance," Thomas replied evenly, "and Eleanor's analysis was hardly nonsense. The commissioners clearly found merit in it." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "This marriage was meant to bring Bennett land under our control, not to turn my son against me. What's happened to you, Thomas?" The question lingered between them, demanding an answer that Thomas had only recently acknowledged to himself. "I've found my own voice," he said finally, "and realized that Eleanor's perspective has value, not just for the land, but for the kind of man I want to be." "Sentimental drivel," Jackson scoffed. "I raised you to be stronger than this." "You raised me to do what you thought was right," Thomas corrected. "Now I'm doing what I know is right." Jackson studied his son with cold calculation. "You've developed feelings for her, the Bennett girl. This arranged marriage has turned your head." It wasn't a question, but Thomas answered anyway. "Eleanor is remarkable, father, intelligent, principled, genuinely concerned with more than her own interests. Yes, I've developed feelings for her. Respect, admiration, and more that's not your concern." "She'll ruin everything I've built," Jackson warned, "with her conservation notions and her influence over you." "Or perhaps she'll help build something better," Thomas countered. "Something that lasts because it works with the land rather than dominating it." Jackson's laugh was bitter. "You sound just like her father. Isaac Bennett was always preaching about working with the land, preserving balance. Look where it got him, dead with a failing ranch and a spinster daughter forced into marriage. A daughter who might just hold the key to more wealth than all your cattle combined, Thomas replied, watching his father's expression carefully. Jackson froze. What are you talking about? Thomas considered his next words carefully. The silver deposit had remained their closely guarded secret, but perhaps it was time to use it as leverage. Eleanor and I have formed a partnership beyond what you arranged, he said finally, one based on mutual respect and shared vision. The details aren't important right now, except to say that Bennett land holds more value than you've imagined. Before Jackson could press further, Eleanor approached, her expression both tired and triumphant. The commissioners have requested a site visit to both proposed routes tomorrow, she announced. They were particularly interested in seeing the springs I mentioned. Jackson's eyes darted between them, suspicion and calculation evident in his gaze. This isn't over, he said tersely before striding away toward the saloon where his supporters had gathered. As Thomas and Eleanor began their journey back to Blackwood Ridge, the setting sun painted the landscape in gold and shadow. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, each processing the events of the meeting. You were magnificent today, Thomas said finally. Eleanor glanced at him, a hint of color touching her cheeks at the compliment. As were you. It couldn't have been easy to publicly disagree with your father. Strangely, it was easier than I expected, Thomas admitted. Perhaps because I knew I was speaking truth. Eleanor studied him in the fading light. Something's changed, she observed, between us. The directness of her statement was so characteristic that Thomas found himself smiling. Yes, he agreed simply. It has. When? She asked. Thomas considered the question seriously. Not all at once. Perhaps it began when you showed me the map with the silver deposit, or when you saved Fletcher's life, or watching you face down decades of prejudice with dignity at the Jenkins dinner. He paused, finding the right words. But I think I fully realized it tonight. Seeing you stand before the entire community, speaking with such conviction and knowledge. Realized what? Eleanor pressed gently. Thomas turned to meet her gaze directly. That our arrangement has become something I never expected, something I value above all else. The words hung between them, not quite a declaration, but more than a mere acknowledgement. Eleanor's expression softened, vulnerability and hope visible in the fading light. I've been afraid to trust this, she admitted quietly. After years of isolation, to suddenly find understanding, respect, it seemed too fragile to acknowledge. Thomas reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. Not fragile, he assured her. Perhaps unexpected, but real nonetheless. They continued toward home, hand in hand, the touch speaking volumes that words had yet to fully express. As Blackwood Ridge came into view, Eleanor tightened her grip slightly. There will be consequences, she said. Your father won't accept defeat easily, whether regarding the railroad or your independence. No, Thomas agreed, but we'll face them together. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of activity. The commissioners conducted their site visits, examining both proposed routes with meticulous attention to detail. Eleanor guided them through Pine Valley, demonstrating the interconnected water systems she had described, while Jackson showcased the economic potential of his preferred route. Through it all, Thomas observed his father's increasing frustration as the commissioners appeared to lean toward the northeastern alternative. Jackson's tactics grew more desperate, veiled threats about withdrawing support, promises of exclusive shipping arrangements, even attempts to discredit Eleanor's environmental concerns as feminine sentimentality. None of it appeared to sway the commissioners, who maintained professional neutrality while asking probing questions that suggested they recognized the merit in Eleanor's analysis. On the evening before the decision was to be announced, Thomas returned to the guest house to find Eleanor sitting on the porch steps, watching the sunset with a pensive expression. "Worried about tomorrow?" he asked, settling beside her. "Not about the railroad," she replied. "The commissioners understand the logical arguments for the northeastern route. I'm confident in their assessment." "What then?" Eleanor turned to face him fully. "Your father came to see me today while you were checking the north pasture." Thomas tensed immediately. "What did he want?" "To offer a deal," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "He knows about the silver, Thomas. I don't know how, but he does." Cold dread settled in Thomas's stomach. What kind of deal? "If I support his railroad route publicly tomorrow and sign over mining rights to the silver deposit, he'll allow our marriage to continue and even make you equal partner in all Blackwood enterprises." Her gaze was unwavering. He said it was a generous offer, considering what he could do if he chose to be less accommodating. Anger flared in Thomas, hot and immediate. "He threatened you." "Not explicitly," Eleanor clarified, "but the implication was clear. He believes he still holds power over both of us." Thomas stood abruptly, prepared to confront his father immediately, but Eleanor's hand on his arm stopped him. "Wait," she said firmly. "I haven't told you my answer yet." Thomas stilled, suddenly aware of the calm determination in her expression. "I told him," Eleanor continued, "that his offer made one thing absolutely clear. He still doesn't understand what matters to me, to us, or to this land. I told him the silver deposit belongs to the valley, not to any Blackwood or Bennett, and its development would happen responsibly or not at all." Relief and admiration flooded through Thomas. How did he take that? A small smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Not well, but as he was leaving, I offered him something else. A genuine partnership between our families based on mutual respect and shared stewardship of the land. I told him he could be part of building something better than either he or my father managed alone. And he didn't accept," Eleanor acknowledged. "But he didn't reject it outright either. I think beneath all his bluster and control, your father is beginning to recognize that times are changing." Thomas sat beside her again, taking her hand in his. "You continue to amaze me, Eleanor Blackwood." "Is that why you've been carrying my mother's ring in your pocket for the past week?" she asked, her direct gaze softened by the hint of a smile. Thomas blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "I noticed when you kept touching your pocket at the town meeting," Eleanor explained, "and I may have glimpsed it when you were changing clothes yesterday." A laugh escaped Thomas, genuine and unguarded. "So much for my attempt at a proper moment." We've never been particularly conventional," Eleanor pointed out. "Why start now?" Thomas removed the ring from his pocket, a simple gold band with a small sapphire that had been his mother's most treasured possession. "I've been waiting for the right moment," he admitted, "to ask if you would consider making our arrangement into something real and chosen. Not because of land or family obligation, but because I've come to love you, Eleanor Bennett Blackwood." Eleanor's eyes shone in the fading light. "I already chose you," she said softly, "the day I showed you the map. I chose to trust you when trust didn't come easily. And now? Now I choose to love you," she replied simply, with clear eyes and an open heart. Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, where it nestled beside the plain band from their wedding ceremony, the symbol of obligation now paired with one of choice. As darkness settled over Blackwood Ridge, they remained on the porch steps, talking quietly about the future. A silver mine developed with care for the land, a ranch managed with consideration for more than profit, a marriage built on partnership rather than possession. The challenges ahead remain substantial. Jackson Blackwood would not easily surrender control or vision. The railroad's decision, whatever it might be, would bring change to the territory. The silver deposit would attract attention and greed from those less principled than themselves. But as the first stars appeared in the Montana sky, Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood faced these uncertainties together, no longer bound by merely duty or circumstance, but by a deeper connection forged through crisis, respect, and ultimately love. They're freely chosen. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.